The Neurodiversity Book by Ronnie. To my parents, who knew none of this, to my children who will, and to my best friend, Lucy, who is bringing our first into this world while I write this. Introduction. As a young boy, I loved two things: reading books and the idea that one day I would write my own. When I received my late diagnosis, I had to go away and understand it, and everything, all over again, and properly this time. It felt from that very moment as if everything I was taught and every institution, organisation and elder that tried to teach me didn't just fail in doing so, but had failed me in doing so. I knew from then on that I must go inwards to truly understand, and that my first book would be what I emerged from that cave with. This book, the Neurodiversity Book, is what I now know and believe needs to be shared. From the present moment in which I am writing these words, I have spent a total of 9 years in the workplace and just under 16 years in the education system. I have survived both, just about. My diagnosis arrived not as revelation, but as confirmation. The systems I had been trying to navigate, to no avail, were never designed for me. Despite feeling out of place all of those years, I was never broken, but I was fundamentally incompatible with those systems. The standard response to this incompatibility is accommodation and awareness weeks. Adjust the surface of the environment slightly and raise awareness and promote acceptance with a few posters and social media posts. How has that approach served us, looking back? It doesn't do a thing. Well, it does make us feel we have done a thing, at least, though I don't know if that should count for anything. This approach treats neurodivergence as a problem requiring management and demanding awareness and inclusion by the system, whichever one it may be, family, friends, parents, government, education, workplace, justice, etc., rather than a natural difference requiring coherence by all, beginning with the individual. Know thyself and all that. So coherence is what this book is about. Knowing the thing that we're dealing with here, neurodiversity, and not just getting caught up in a movement that has not moved anywhere. This is not an empowerment book. It's not self-help. It's not coping strategies. It's not another influencer or activist telling you, quote, how to be you. Not another guide to, quote, thriving with ADHD or understanding your autistic child. Because the truth is this: neurodivergent humans are not broken versions of neurotypical ones. They operate from different baseline settings, different brain network ratios, different salience patterns. Once this is actually understood, which up until now it has not been, the question stops being how to fix this, but how to build structures that allow coherent operation instead of constant comparison and compensation. I built the Neurodiversity Directory because a smattering of solutions exist, but remain scattered and inaccessible. This book exists for the same reason. The knowledge was already there, but had not been synthesized into something useful, and most importantly, usable, by the people who need it most. This book is for them. For the neurodivergent individual trying to stop being a passenger in other people's systems, and for those who care about them enough to understand why they operate differently. For the company trying to build environments where neurodivergent talent actually functions, instead of just leaving the workplace and not coming back. Think of it like a technical manual for a different operating system for those whose numbers are rising so rapidly that the phenomenon itself is being called an epidemic. This is your reference material. What follows is not ideology. It is not progressiveness, the performance of caring about progress. It is actual progress, direct, measurable understanding that results in functional coherence. It's what a company downloads to understand what they're actually dealing with. It's what a neurodivergent person uses to explain themselves to others. and it's what one would read to understand what it is like to only ever experience living on the inside of said epidemic. For anyone seeking to understand what neurodivergent coherence actually requires, this book is your vehicle. What you do with it is your navigation. A note on the semiotics of the neurodiversity glyph. The glyph on this book's cover, omnipresent across my other work in neurodiversity, precisely places my proposition on this subject in one small yet powerful symbol: continual, in-place oscillation between two poles collapsed into singularity, contained within wholeness. Not two opposing forces in constant tension, but integration, coherence. The end of being pulled between what you authentically are inside and what the external reality you inhabit demands you to be. A note on the hidden theme throughout the book. This book contains powerful ideas that will herald new shifts and alter perceptions and paradigms, and the chapters are set out in a particular order for a reason, all including the minimum amount of specific information for maximum effect. Behind the obvious theme of the Neurodiversity book, there lies a hidden one, a secret behind the surface, you could say. This secret runs throughout the entire book, appearing at least once in each part. It's indeed more powerful than anything I could say overtly, and for that reason it is more beneficial and penetrating for you to arrive at the secret yourself. If you think you have found it, contact me. I'll buy you dinner. Some readers will recognise it immediately. Others will need to reach the end before it clicks. For others, it may take multiple readings. It will, inevitably, only become apparent once you, as the reader, are ready for it. Either way, once you spot it, everything changes. Until then, don't refrain from understanding and integrating the seeds that are on the surface. And do not give up with this book until you have reached the root beneath it all. Part 1. The Mythology of Normal. The Epidemic That Isn't. Neurodivergent diagnoses have increased exponentially over the past 2 decades. The numbers are undeniable and no longer ignorable. ADHD diagnosis in children rose by 43% between 2003 and 2016. Autism diagnosis increased from 1 in 150 children in the year 2000 to 1 in 36 children in 2023. Adult diagnoses are surging even faster as late identified individuals, people who survived childhood undiagnosed, finally receive explanations for decades of incompatibility. This is being labelled an epidemic, albeit by a loud minority, responding in their old age to stark figures they don't truly understand. Epidemic, noun. A widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a community at a particular time. The word epidemic itself implies an out-of-control contagion that needs to be contained, then cured. It suggests that neurodivergence is new, increasing, and fundamentally pathological. This framing is wrong, but not entirely. Bear with me here. What is actually happening is more complex than either we're just recognising what was always there, or modern life is creating neurodivergent brains. Both statements contain truth, both also miss the essential point. Neurodivergent humans have always existed. The people who couldn't sit still in a medieval monastery. The people who focus singularly and extensively for days on a slightly odd thing, looking at you, Da Vinci, who famously wrote to himself in one of his notebooks to observe the goose's foot. The people who processed sensory information differently. Famously, the likes of Kafka, Darwin, Chekhov, to name a few, had difficulty shutting out competing sensory information, a hallmark of neurodivergent experience. They have always existed. They were the craftsmen, the inventors, the pattern recognizers, the ones who saw connections that others missed. In fact, Within environments that allow for flexibility, varied demands, and a tolerance for different operating systems, neurodivergent traits are often advantageous and at minimum more than manageable. Now, as I'm at risk of barking up the superpower tree here, I'll get back to reality. Because along came industrial standardization. Factory lines, compulsory education designed to produce compliant workers. And the offices. Oh, the open plan offices, with forced fun and fluorescent lighting. 8-hour days of sustained executive function. Environments engineered for uniformity of operation at the lower levels and profitable predictability at the power levels. Neurodivergent humans didn't change. Cognitive variance is not a new phenomenon. Our whole world has changed, and our rigid expectations of what being a human must mean has remained backwards. We are conscious animals on a floating rock with all the other animals. We still operate with our Paleolithic emotions, while expecting ourselves to thrive within our still medieval institutions, while hooked up to superhuman technology all hours of the day. With, and here's the real kicker, our self-awareness to all of this obviousness diminishing daily because we're so used to it. In fact, some of us, and soon to be most of us, were born without knowing any difference to this always-on entropy that categorises the human experience in 2025 and beyond. Our environments endlessly accelerate their demands on us. More stimulation, more novelty, more multitasking, more faux connectivity, more speed, yet, somehow, less margin for difference. When you consider the truth that we aren't just any animal, but dopaminergic mammals, all of those demands do not have a fleeting effect on us. So yes, there are genuine real-world environmental factors amplifying neurodivergent presentations in real time. Nature's cousin, nurture. Industrial toxins affecting brain development. Social fragmentation removing traditional support structures and community frameworks. Information overload creating sustained cognitive demands that the minds of previous generations never faced. Technology that simultaneously helps and harms. Blue lights past sundown, an experience unprecedented up until now in human history, contributing to neurodivergent symptoms thanks to circadian dysregulation. The circadian system being another one of our key mammalian operating systems, largely untouched and unaffected since time immemorial. But the fundamental reality remains. We are pathologizing natural human variation at the exact moment our technological society has created environments that amplify differences which were previously manageable or advantageous. The, quote, epidemic is not neurodivergence spreading. It is incompatibility becoming unbearable. This distinction matters because it determines a solution. If neurodivergence is a disease, the solution is cure or containment. If neurodivergence is natural variation meeting a hostile and irreconcilable reality, the solution is coherence. Understanding how neurodivergent systems actually operate and building structures that allow function instead of constant compensation. After years of searching for an answer to this predicament, I settled on the latter. Not containment and cure, but coherence. Not because it is kinder or more inclusive, but because it is accurate. Neurodivergent brains are not malfunctioning or indeed dysfunctioning. They are merely operating according to a different set of specifications than the environments, systems, and institutions expect of them, as they themselves were designed for the specifications that are the opposite. That is polarity by definition, and therefore was always going to lead to the polarizing position we perceive today when we speak of neurodiversity. It is because of this present polarity that I felt it paramount to begin by directly discussing this epidemic idea. What follows is not a guide to fixing yourself to fit the system. The system hasn't paid me enough to work on its behalf, and it couldn't even if it tried. Instead, what follows is a technical manual for understanding the different operating systems we call neurodivergent, so that it is possible to build environments, internal and external, where that system functions coherently. The science of complexity states that the more complex a situation is, the more inherently simple the solution must be. The epidemic framing wants us to believe that we don't fit in and need to be cured, and until then, accommodated to the nth degree. I'm operating from a different and more workable premise. We need to understand what we're working with so we can stop trying to be something we are not and stop trying to achieve something we cannot. What it actually means to be neurodivergent. The standard definition will tell you that neurodivergent means having a brain that processes, learns, and behaves differently from the societal standard of typical. And hey, it's not entirely wrong, and is the definition standard for a reason. But this framing creates an immediate problem. It establishes a binary between typical and non-typical, normal and different, functional and dysfunctional, and it leaves it there. This is backwards. Neurodivergence is not defined by difference alone. Plenty of people have brains that process, learn, and behave differently from statistical averages. What makes someone diagnosably neurodivergent is not the presence of traits alone. It is the presence of traits plus demonstrated difficulty functioning within existing structures. This distinction is critical and rarely acknowledged. This is why some people say things like, well, aren't we all a bit ADHD? Just because they're addicted to their smartphone? You can have every ADHD trait listed in diagnostic criteria. You can have intense hyperfocus, executive function challenges, sensory sensitivities, difficulty with sustained attention on uninteresting tasks. Sure. But if you are managing, if you have found ways to function within the systems you inhabit without significant impairment, you will not receive a diagnosis. Or more accurately, you will not be considered to need one. The diagnostic threshold is not, do you have these traits? It is, do these traits cause you significant difficulty in educational, occupational, or social functioning? What this reveals is that the concern is not actually the traits themselves. The concern is compatibility with existing structures. The question being asked is not, how does your brain work, but can you function in the holes we have built? Neurodivergent humans, then, are square pegs. These systems, education, workplace, social expectations, are round holes. The epidemic is not an increase in square pegs. It is round holes becoming smaller, more rigid, more demanding, less tolerant of variation. A square peg in a slightly flexible hole with room for variation might manage. A square peg in an increasingly rigid, optimized for roundness hole will experience difficulty, and difficulty is what triggers diagnosis. This is why the entire discourse focuses on the pegs: symptoms, deficits, dysfunction, accommodations, awareness. The conversation is about making the square pegs more round, and advocating for the round holes to tolerate the square pegs, and raising awareness that the square pegs exist and deserve inclusion by the round holes. Dizzying, right? But I'm not wrong. This is indeed the entire discourse, in one paragraph. But the fundamental issue is not the pegs. It is the presently prevailing paradigm that there is one correct, standard and typical whole, and anyone that does not fit it is a pathological problem. It is also nobody's fault that the neurodiversity paradigm hasn't changed this yet, and all it has done is create a parallel paradigm that runs alongside it on its road to nowhere. Neurodivergent humans are not malfunctioning. They are operating according to different internal specifications within external systems that are entirely designed for the opposite set of specifications. The sensitivity inherent to neurodivergence is not mere emotional fragility that leaves them predisposed to overwhelm. It is sensitivity to the inherent incompatibility. The square peg feels the edges of the round hole in a way round pegs never do, because for round pegs, the hole is invisible. It is just reality. They get on with it. And if others can't, they must be labelled and treated. For neurodivergent humans, the hole is always visible, always present, always demanding adjustment, compensation, masking, effort, and always reminding them that they are a square peg. I am not advocating for making the holes more inclusive. That dried out approach, accommodation, awareness, acceptance, treats neurodivergence as a problem requiring systemic management. It keeps square pegs waiting for ability and permission from powers outside of them to exist in the round holes, entitled while they wait, while nothing happens. That is not the level of empowerment that quote movements and quote campaigns think that they are achieving. I am positing an entirely different premise. We must stop cycling this presumption that a concentric outcome is what we should all fit into, and start asking what a square hole looks like. Neurodiversity is the new mental health. If you're reading this, you more than likely know that the term neurodiversity was coined in the late 1990s by sociologist Judy Singer, an autistic woman who recognised that neurological differences should be understood as natural human variation rather than pathology. Around the same time, journalist Harvey Bloom wrote in The Atlantic that, quote, neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. This was radical. For the first time, a framework existed that challenged the medical model's insistence on deficit and disorder. Autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia. These were not diseases to be cured, but differences to be understood and accommodated. The neurodiversity movement, from its conception up until now, achieved significant progress. It brought the conversation out of clinical settings and into public discourse. It challenged stigma. It created the potential for community. It gave neurodivergent people language to describe their experiences without only internalizing pathology. It pushed for workplace accommodations, educational reforms, and broader cultural awareness. Without this movement, the progressives who championed these ideas, organised the campaigns, advocated for awareness, and fought for inclusion, we would not be where we are today. That must be acknowledged. That foundation was necessary. The idea had to exist before the thing itself could be built. But here is where we must pause and assess honestly. Has the movement produced the progress it promised? The numbers suggest otherwise. Despite 2 decades of advocacy and awareness campaigns, all flown under the flag of progress, progress remains non-palpable. I wish I was wrong. Neurodivergent employment rates remain abysmal, with just 21% of autistic people in employment. Workplace accommodations exist in policy but rarely in practice, with 80% of ADHD adults reporting never having received workplace support or reasonable adjustments. Education systems continue to fail neurodivergent children at alarming rates, with around 67% of those with a neurodivergent child in education reporting to still be awaiting assessment. NHS waiting lists defy comprehension, with a backlog of over 500,000 people in England on a waiting list for assessment that calculations claim will take some 2,000 years to clear. Late diagnosis continue to surge, with more adults now diagnosed with autism than ever, as adults realise they spent decades trying to fit into systems never designed for them. A vacuum can only exist by the things which enclose it. It is in this first chapter that I have laid out everything that does just that. If, by the time you are done with this book, it has all become clear to you, you will be part of the new body of coherence that will be responsible for giving the neurodiversity movement, the movement that has not moved, the legs it has lacked. The movement created the foundations, which I've already given it credit for, and created visibility, but all without functionality and any integrated practicality. It has allowed awareness, but awareness without coherence is fragmentation. The ability to see the pieces, but the inability to connect them into meaningful patterns or actionable insight. It has carved out acceptance, but acceptance without understanding is compliance. Agreeing to something without truly grasping its nature, context, or implications. A surface level surrender with no roots. This is the problem with progressiveness as identity rather than action. When being progressive, identifying as someone who cares about neurodiversity becomes the goal, actual progress becomes secondary. And ironically, something that doesn't get round to being achieved. The performance of caring replaces the work of building. In 2018, I heard a psychologist say that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, but connection. This line introduced me to the concept that opposites are not always what they seem. They can be contentious, they can be surprising, and indeed they are often most productive when they are exactly that. To illustrate my point, the opposite of impatience is not patience, as you may think. It is presence. The opposite of progressiveness, then, is not opposition to the idea, being anti-progress, or someone who's part of the problem. The opposite is direct, measurable action that results in progress. Progressiveness is a token for progress, but not progress itself. Just as money is a token for transactions, but means nothing on its own. Just as the word leaf is not the leaf itself, but merely the name for the thing we are describing on the tree. The neurodiversity movement, in its current form, has become progressiveness. It is the idea of progress. And the idea, by definition, distracts from the actual work, which happens to be my work now. A prerequisite to actualize progress is service, not self-serving identity, but service to the whole. The Arthurian legend of Percival and the Grail teaches us precisely. When the young fool approaches the wounded king, he does not ask, "How can I be healed?" He asks, "How can I serve the Grail?" In every version of this tale where he does not act with this precise question, he fails. The point of one of the only things that came out of a period within Western European history is that Percival must realise that his own healing is linked to the healing of the whole. He sidesteps the need for divine intervention or personal transformation and recognises that opposing forces can only be reconciled by asking the right question and then living the answer. Collapsing polarity into coherence, then integration. Sound familiar? The neurodiversity movement, as it currently operates, is serving whom? The neurodivergent individuals starved for coherence and functionality, or the identities of those who identify with the progressive movement? All facts point to the latter, with the former holding nothing but a dearth of evidence that they are being, or have been, served in any way, shape or form. So if actual progress is the goal, then progressiveness, its opposite, the performance, the awareness weeks, the social media campaigns, the self-congratulatory inclusion initiatives, must be recognised for what they are. Mere distraction from the work itself that some may even participate in order to continue kicking the can down the road with doing anything meaningful about anything. So, where are we at right now in society with the neurodiversity movement? We started with mental health, understanding and reconciling with how we and others feel. Now we've moved a step deeper, understanding and reconciling with who we all actually are. Mental health was liberated from the irrational privacy and illogical isolation it maintained for too long. It became acceptable to discuss anxiety, depression, burnout, and where each of us might be at mentally. This was progress. Real, measurable progress that allowed for real, measurable impact. But mental health addresses states and responses to being, temporary conditions and fluctuating experiences to circumstances. Neurodiversity, on the other hand, addresses traits and types of being, permanent characteristics, baseline operations, fundamental differences in how a brain is wired. This deeper step requires a deeper sense of responsibility. Not just knowing how you feel, but knowing exactly how your being operates in every conceivable sense. Only then can you live accordingly, in alignment and resonance with how your system actually functions. With the knowledge of neurodiversity, one can still live however they choose. Free will remains. But without correct understanding, we are blind and our inner beings remain eternal victims to external reality. And the lesson we learn from the mental health, that silence and isolation serve no one, applies here as well. The neurodiversity movement gave us language. It gave us permission to exist. It gave us visibility. These were necessary first steps. But we are still exactly where we need to be, at the threshold between awareness and coherence, between the idea of progress and actual functional progress, between identifying as neurodivergent and understanding what that actually means, and being in a felt position of power where we can actually do something about that. I'm writing from that threshold, not to dismiss what the movement achieved, but to move beyond progressiveness into actualized progress. Not to reject the framework, but to build something functional within it, finally. The task is simple. Make the neurodivergent human coherent, thus making the round hole square. As it's not until the neurodivergent know themselves enough and are integrated enough in their neurodivergence that there can be any entitlement whatsoever towards the round hole. It will continue cracking on, functioning, while the neurodivergent remains not accommodated, not included, not aware. But remember, the task is no longer accommodation, inclusion, or awareness. It's coherence. That is the path forward. That is the new mental health. And this is where we go from here. The neurodivergent treatment industrial complex and the economics of inevitability. The one-way street of expansion. There is a simple economic reality underlying this epidemic of neurodivergent people that must be stated plainly. The system profits from expansion. More diagnoses mean more revenue for diagnostic services. More prescriptions mean more revenue for pharmaceutical companies. More identified neurodivergent individuals mean more demand for assessments, treatments, coaching, accommodations, and support services. This is not a conspiracy. It is basic economics. When revenue increases with volume, there is no financial incentive to reduce that volume. Instead, there's every incentive to expand it. It's a simple loop that reinforces itself. that's been in place since it started. Pathologize, diagnose, treat, pathologize, with incentives at every part of that chain. Each link generates revenue. Each step creates dependency on the next. And critically, there is no economic mechanism that reverses the flow. No financial incentive to say, actually, fewer people need diagnosis, or perhaps medication isn't necessary here. The system rewards expansion, not restraint. In the UK, private ADHD and ASD assessment services have proliferated rapidly over the past 5 years as NHS waiting lists become untenable. A private assessment costs between £750 to £1,500, depending on provider and assessment complexity. This includes an initial consultation, the diagnostic assessment itself, usually 2 to 3 hours, and a written report. Expect the providers to need further payments for any initiation of treatment on top of receiving the certificate that you passed. Then there is titration of that medication and follow-up appointments that are compulsory, leaving a total cost for an assessment and treatment anywhere in the range of £1,000 to £3,000. The medication prescriptions themselves, often required monthly or quarterly, generate ongoing revenue for both the prescribers and the pharmaceutical manufacturers. The growth of these markets are directly proportional to the diagnostic rates. In the United States, the ADHD medication market alone was valued at $35 billion in 2024 and is projected to reach $38 billion by 2025 and $78 billion by 2033. There's no data on the assessment providers, but you only need to dare to use your imagination. These are not small industries. They are significant economic sectors with institutional investors, lobbyists, publicly traded companies, and massive profit margins. To be clear, this does not mean every clinician is motivated by profit. It does not mean pharmaceutical companies are evil. It does not mean support services provide no value. Many do. Many are essential. But the structural incentives are undeniable. When an entire economic ecosystem depends on its models of scale, increasing diagnostic and treatment rates, that ecosystem will expand. Not because of malice, but because that is what economic systems do when incentivized to do so. The train has left the station, and it will not stop, because stopping would require the system to voluntarily contract its own revenue base, a thing economic systems do not do unless forced by internal collapse, which won't happen, or external regulation, which also will not. This creates a specific problem for neurodivergent individuals seeking coherence rather than dependence. The system is optimized for perpetual treatment, not functional independence. Your functional independence is only something that exists in your own interests. Thus, pathologizing becomes a defaultly practical route. Not because it is most accurate, but because it is most profitable. A square peg struggling in a round hole can be diagnosed, medicated, coached, accommodated, each step generating revenue for the existing markets. Meanwhile, a square peg who builds their own square hole, functioning independently, generates nothing for them. The economic incentives, therefore, are not neutral. They actively favour pathology over coherence, dependence over sovereignty, and blanket treatment over individual function. This is a one-way street, and understanding it is essential to understanding why the neurodiversity movement, despite its progressive ideals, has not produced functional progress. Because the economic structures beneath the surface, the only actual roots, rewards visibility and advocacy, identity and ego, and diagnosis and treatment, the neurodivergent treatment industrial complex, not coherence and independence. Industrial standardization as both the culprit and propulsion. The round holes were not always round. In fact, for most of human history, there were no standardized holes at all. Are you ready for the recap? Strap in. Circa 800 Common Era to 1350 Common Era. Under feudalism, monarch at the top, lords owned the land, serfs bound to it, little social mobility as wealth equals land ownership. Life was brutal and hierarchical, but it was not standardised. A serf worked the land according to seasonal rhythms. A blacksmith worked at his own pace on individual commissions. A merchant travelled and traded according to opportunity. There was no expectation of uniform output, no 8-hour workday, no compulsory attendance. Social roles were rigid, sure, but cognitive demands were varied, and there were no real conveyor belts of people production like there are today. Circa 1350 to 1500. The Black Death wiped out almost 60% of the European population and triggered the Renaissance. Humanism, scientific inquiry, artistic expression. But daily life for most remained agrarian and locally organised. Feudalism gradually declined, and the labour shortage from the plague gave workers more bargaining power. Circa 1500 to 1750. Mercantilism and early capitalism emerged. Wealth was no longer bound to land. Instead, trade expansion was a new economy of scale. Colonial empires extracted resources across continents. Wealth concentrated, but production itself remained largely artisanal. Craftsmen, traders, farmers, etc. Work was still largely individualised, self-directed, and varied in its own demands. Though due to the expansion of trade, thus the economics of demand and supply, the wage labour system began. Circa 1750 to 2020. Then, in a blink, everything changed. The Industrial Revolution was not a gradual shift. It was a rupture. Factories appeared, assembly lines replaced workshops, machines and managers dictated the pace of human labour. For the first time in history, human beings were required to synchronise their bodies and minds to mechanical processes and industrial operations for scale. Factories required standardisation, predictable labour, repetitive tasks, sustained attention, conformity to schedules. Workers needed to arrive at the same time, perform identical actions for identical durations, and produce consistent output. Variation was inefficiency. Difference was loss. This was not arbitrary cruelty. It was economic rationality. Standardization at scale produces efficiency. Efficiency produces profit. Profit produces expansion. And expansion perpetuates the initial standardization that worked when scaled. To feed the factories, and later to fill the ranks of industrialized warfare, the education system was redesigned. The British school system, mirrored across the industrializing world, was explicitly structured to produce compliant factory workers and obedient conscripts. Students were trained to sit still for hours, follow instructions without question, complete repetitive tasks on demand, and respond to bell signalling when to start and stop. If they were not good at this, they were whacked. Remember? This was just my father's generation. And as a Cain himself, he had no choice but to find refuge in the irony. This was the birth of the round hole at the nation-state level. Environments engineered for uniformity, predictability, and conformity. Not because uniformity is inherently superior, but because it is firstly predictable and programmable at the power level, then scalable and profitable at the industrial level. Before this moment, before circa 1800, there was no such thing as a typical cognitive expectation applied uniformly across entire populations. Society had roles, certainly, but those roles did not demand that every human brain operate identically for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week across standardized tasks. The round hole is new, historically recent, and it emerged with astonishing speed, to the point where we've just got on with it and seem to have amnesia around the bigger picture. From the first factories in the late 1700s, to compulsory education in the late 1800s, to modern open plan offices and always connected knowledge work in the 2000s. This entire structure was built in roughly 200 years, a fraction of a blink in the timeline of human existence. Circa 2020 to what's emerging. I coined the emerging post-COVID age we are in the age of algorithmic serfdom. You own none of the things you depend on and pay rent to everything perpetually. Algorithms control and define information, visibility, access, community, opportunity, and wealth. We are living inside an experiment that started yesterday, relatively speaking, and we are confused about why so many people are struggling to fit. And worse, I sense that the majority of those that don't fit are also confused as to why that may be. I reiterate my line. We're a species with Paleolithic emotions, living in medieval institutions, while hooked up to superhuman technology 24/7 with an ever-diminishing self-awareness. Square pegs, neurodivergent humans who cannot sit still, who need varied tasks, who process information differently, who struggle with sustained repetitive output, became problems, not because they were deficient, but because they were incompatible with the new round hole. For the approximately 14,000 years of human civilization prior to the present, these individuals functioned. They were the pattern recognizers, the hyper-focused craftsmen, the sensory-sensitive scouts, the novelty seekers who explored beyond known territory. Variation in cognition was not pathology, it was simply variation. No doubt welcomed, appreciated, and given its place. But industrial standardization removed that idea and replaced it with the paradigm of problematic. The round hole became the only hole, and anyone who did not fit was now, by definition, disordered, as they didn't fit the required order. And critically, industrial standardization is not going away. Modern civilization depends on it. Supply chains, global commerce, technological infrastructure, healthcare systems, transportation networks, all rely on standardized processes, predictable outputs, and uniform protocols. The open plan office is a direct descendant of the factory floor. The 8-hour workday persists not because it is optimal for human function, but because it is administratively convenient at scale. Even as we moved from manufacturing to service economies to knowledge work, the round hole simply changed shape slightly. It did not disappear. Software development, financial services, healthcare administration, education, law, all demand sustained executive function, prolonged attention, multitasking across physical and digital ecosystems, and conformity to standardized workflows. In fact, and this is not dismissible, the cognitive demands have intensified. Factory work, all else aside, required physical repetition for one thing in one place. Modern work requires constant executive function, sustained attention across competing stimuli, rapid task switching, and perpetual connectivity. All while the round hole has become smaller, more rigid, and more demanding. This is why industrial standardization is both culprit and propulsion. It is the culprit because it created environments fundamentally incompatible with neurodivergent operation. The square peg problem is a direct result of designing all systems for round pegs. It is the propulsion because it ensures the problem will expand, not contract. As standardization scales, more connectivity, more automation, more optimization for efficiency, the demands on human cognition intensify. The round holes get tighter. More square pegs experience incompatibility. More diagnoses follow. More markets expand. Industrial standardization cannot reverse itself. Modern economies would collapse without it. There will be no return to pre-industrial flexibility. No dismantling of compulsory education. No abolition of the standardized workday. No restructuring of global systems to accommodate infinite cognitive variation. The revolution will not be televised, as it will either not happen or it's not something that could be seen on TV in the first place. Ultimately, the round hole is a permanent phenomena and one that is proliferating. So here we are, 200 years into an experiment in mass cognitive uniformity, confused about why an epidemic of neurodivergence has appeared. But the picture is already painted. It is really obvious how we got here and what is going on. Human brains did not suddenly start breaking. We did, though, suddenly stop scaling our world with our nature. More accurately, our environments and systems were designed for one type of specification: the typical, the programmable, the predictable, the conforming, the conscriptable, the controllable. And everyone else became pathologized by default. The rising diagnostic rates are not a mystery. They are the inevitable result of increasingly standardized, cognitively demanding environments meeting human brains that were never designed for such uniformity. Why the medical model arose when it did. The medical model arose to manage this incompatibility. If square pegs cannot fit round holes, and round holes cannot change, then square pegs must be identified, diagnosed, and treated until they approximate roundness, or at minimum until they stop jamming the machinery. Which brings us to the final piece of this puzzle: why the system that profits from this arrangement will not voluntarily change, and what that means for anyone seeking coherence rather than perpetual treatment. The medicalisation of neurodivergence did not happen in a vacuum. It emerged at specific historical moments in direct response to the demands of industrial standardisation reaching critical mass. ADHD was first described as a medical condition in 1902 by British paediatrician George Still, who observed children with, quote, an abnormal defect of moral control. But it did not become a widespread diagnosis until the 1960s and 70s, precisely when compulsory education had become universal and classroom management at scale became a logistical necessity. Children who could not sit still, who could not sustain attention on boring tasks, who disrupted the orderly functioning of those who were not disruptive in the factory model schools, became medical problems requiring pharmaceutical management. Or they just continue rocking the boat too much, with their abnormal defects of moral control, as Still would put it. Ritalin, the first widely prescribed ADHD medication, was approved by the FDA in 1955. Its use exploded in the following decades as schools demanded solutions for students who did not conform to the standardized behavioral expectations. Autism was formally recognized as a distinct diagnosis in 1943 by psychiatrist Leo Kanner, but it remained relatively rare and narrowly defined until the DSM-4 in 1994 broadened the criteria significantly, creating what we called the autism spectrum, though the spectrum is now breaking. This expansion of diagnostic criteria coincided with the rise of knowledge work, service economies, and social demands requiring sustained executive function, theory of mind, and complex social navigation. Individuals who struggle with these demands, previously labelled odd or eccentric but functionally employed, now met diagnostic criteria. Dyslexia, dyspraxia, and dyscalculia were all formalised as learning disabilities in the mid-20th century as literacy and numeracy became non-negotiable requirements for economic participation. Before industrialised education, an inability to read quickly or calculate mentally was inconvenient but not disabling. You were simply someone who happily did something else, as radical as that may sound today. It was after the basically implemented yesterday compulsory schooling and standardised testing that it became pathology. The pattern is consistent. As environments became more standardised and cognitively demanding, the medical model expanded to classify anyone who could not meet those demands as disordered. This was not a conspiracy, it was a practical solution to a practical problem. If modern economies require sustained executive function, predictable output, and conformity to standardised workflows, then individuals who cannot provide these things must be removed from the system. The medical model provided a second option, practically and humanly preferred to purely discarding them: identify, diagnose, medicate, and manage. And crucially, this model generates revenue at every step. The neurodivergent treatment industrial complex is not a shadowy cabal. It is a visible, thriving economic system comprised of diagnostic services, private clinics, educational psychologists, occupational health assessments, revenue per diagnosis between £750 to £3,000 in the UK, higher in the US, pharmaceutical companies manufacturing and distributing stimulant medications, Ritalin, Adderall, Vyvanse, etc., SSRIs, antipsychotics. The ADHD medication market in the UK alone is projected to reach $38 billion in 2025. Ongoing management, titration appointments, follow-up consultations, prescription renewals, consistent retained monthly or quarterly revenue streams per diagnosed individual or customer. Support services, coaching, therapy, workplace assessments, educational accommodations, diversity managers, inclusion consultants, an expanding market with institutional investment and venture capital backing, technology and tools, apps, planners, noise-cancelling headphones, fidget devices, organisational software, sensory rooms and more. Consumer products marketed directly to diagnosed populations and the organisations that manage them. Each component depends on the others. Diagnosis creates demand for medication. Medication requires ongoing management. Management creates opportunities for coaching and support services. Support services identify more individuals who need diagnosis. The loop reinforces. And because the economic incentives align with the structural permanence of industrial standardisation, the system is self-perpetuating. Round holes are not going away. Therefore, square pegs will continue to experience difficulty. Thus, diagnosis and treatment will continue to expand, and on and on and on it will go. There is no financial incentive to reduce diagnostic rates. No economic pressure to question whether these are actually disorders or simply incompatibilities with arbitrary demands. No structural mechanism that rewards helping neurodivergent individuals build their own systems of reality rather than medicating them into compliance with existing ones. The neurodiversity movement, for all its progressive language, operates within this same structure. It advocates for awareness, acceptance, and accommodation so that neurodivergent individuals can be supported enough to fit into the round holes. Accommodation is not coherence, it is managed incompatibility. A ramp is better than stairs for a wheelchair user, certainly. But a neurodivergent person accommodated in a workplace designed for neurotypical operation is still operating in a fundamentally incompatible environment, simply with slightly less friction. The system profits from this arrangement, and it will not voluntarily contract. This is the reality underlying the neurodiversity epidemic. Not a sudden increase in broken brains, but the inevitable outcome of a threefold process. 1. Industrialization and control creating programs of standardization. 2. medical model arising to manage the resulting incompatibility at scale. 3. Economic incentives rewarding the expansion of diagnosis and treatment and perpetuating the pathology loop. The train has left the station. The round holes are permanent. The economic ecosystem is entrenched. And the neurodiversity movement, despite its ideals, has not produced functional coherence because it operates within and relies upon, and often even reinforces, the same system it was created to challenge. On its current trajectory, the neurodiversity movement has become simply a descriptor for the bloom in diagnosed and treated neurodivergent populations. A way to label and categorize the expanding market. A progressive veneer on an industrial medical complex that profits from perpetual incompatibility. Part 2. The reality laid bare. The Rosetta Stone. In part 1 of this book, I deconstructed the mythology of normal that underpins the neurodivergent epidemic narrative and that the neurodiversity movement operates within but has failed to dismantle. The epidemic is incompatibility, not pathology. The square pegs are not broken. The round holes are permanent and rigid for a reason. The system profits from this reality and the expansion of it. The neurodiversity movement, despite its ideals, is now just a descriptor for a rising diagnosed population rather than a force for functional coherence. So if the system will not change, and accommodation is not coherence, then what? Responsibility. Not as punishment, not as abandonment, not as pull yourself up by your bootstraps individualism that ignores systemic reality, but as the only viable starting point for actual coherence. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. No one else can make you coherent. It's an inside job. The system will not fix you. The movement will not save you. Employers will not redesign workplaces around your specific needs. Partners cannot regulate your nervous system for you. Therapists cannot give you self-awareness. Medication cannot teach you how your brain operates. Coherence begins, and can only begin, at the individual level. This is not popular. It runs counter to the entire discourse of the neurodiversity movement, which focuses almost exclusively on what external agents should do differently. Schools should accommodate, workplaces should adapt, society should accept, others should understand. And yes, systemic change matters. Yes, environments could be designed better. Yes, awareness and accommodation reduce friction. In fact, one of my core philosophical tenets is that existence is not an individual matter. But the fundamental premise of the progressive neurodiversity movement is this. Neurodivergent people are entitled to external accommodation before they understand themselves. This is backwards, and it is why the movement has produced visibility without functionality. You cannot expect others to accommodate what you do not understand about yourself. You cannot demand that systems adapt to your needs if you do not know what those needs actually are and why you have them. You cannot advocate for your own coherence if you have not done the work of becoming coherent. The relationship between individual responsibility and collective reality is this. It is not until the individual knows themselves that they can even begin to expect others to have awareness or acceptance of them. There are millions of neurodivergent people in the world. The vast majority do not actually understand how their brains operate. They have diagnoses, they have labels, they may have medication, but they do not have functional self-knowledge. They do not know why their attention works the way it does, what their nervous system needs to regulate, how their sensory processing differs, or what their executive function limitations actually are. And yet 100% of the neurodiversity discourse is about what external agents should do differently for neurodivergent people. This is entitlement without foundation. It is demanding accommodation for something you have not bothered to understand. Responsibility does not mean you are alone. Existence is not an individual matter, remember? You live in systems. You work in environments designed by others. You have relationships, obligations, contexts you did not choose. all of that is real. But if you do not take responsibility for understanding your own operating system, you will remain dependent on external agents to manage your incompatibility, which they will not. You will be a passenger in someone else's diagnosis of you, a recipient of someone else's treatment plan for you, a supplicant waiting for accommodation that will likely never, ever arrive. Or worse, you will become a tyrant, externalizing your power and demanding that the world reshape itself around your unexamined needs. This is the classic slave-tyrant dynamic. The slave, powerless and dependent, allows the tyrant to exist through their powerlessness, and eventually becomes the tyrant themselves, demanding compliance from others to compensate for their own lack of internal coherence. The 3 S's. In my introduction, I called this book a technical manual. The 3 S's are the key to everything inside it. The opposite to being a slave is being sovereign, knowing how you operate, taking responsibility for your own regulation, building structures that allow your system to function rather than waiting for permission to exist. This is what the 3 S's provide, the foundation for coherent neurodivergence. Self-awareness. Knowing exactly how your being operates, not just a diagnosis label, but the actual mechanics, how your attention shifts, what your sensory thresholds are, when your executive function fails, what your nervous system needs to stay regulated, the specific, granular, functional reality of your brain. Self-awareness in this context operates on 2 levels. Macro awareness. Understanding your fundamental operating system, the consistent patterns, the baseline specifications, the architectural reality of how you are built, the archetypal constellation of your character. This is the knowledge that remains stable across contexts. Your core cognitive profile, your sensory processing patterns, your executive function limitations, and your regulation requirements. This is what you must know about yourself in order to build coherent structures. Micro-awareness. Moment-to-moment self-observation. Recognizing in real time what state you are in, what your nervous system is signaling, what you need right now to maintain regulation, when you are approaching dysregulation before you cross the threshold. This is the lived, dynamic awareness that allows you to navigate daily reality without constantly crashing into your own limitations. Both are essential. Macro awareness without micro awareness leaves you with theoretical knowledge but no practical application. Micro awareness without macro awareness leaves you constantly reacting to symptoms without understanding the underlying patterns. Together, they allow the formation of the foundation of functional coherence, knowing who you are and recognizing where you are at any given moment. Without this, by definition, you remain lost. Self-compassion. Self-compassion is not self-indulgence. It is not lowering standards or making excuses. It is the practice of responding to yourself with the same understanding you would offer someone you care about who is also struggling. For neurodivergent individuals, particularly those who spent years undiagnosed, masking and internalizing the message that they were deficient alongside the experience of feeling displaced, self-compassion is not intuitive. The default is self-criticism, harsh judgment, the constant internal refrain of why can't I just do this like everyone else? If you are self-critical, and most neurodivergent people are, it is essential to distinguish between critiquing your ideas and processes versus critiquing yourself. The former is productive, it leads to refinement, improvement, and growth. The latter is destructive. It creates a self-referencing loop of inertia where you remain stuck, unable to move forward because you are too busy attacking your own adequacy. Releasing your brakes begins with self-compassion. And self-compassion requires a 3-fold process. First, recognize when you are experiencing difficulty, not as failure, but as reality. You are struggling. The task is hard. The environment is incompatible. Your nervous system is dysregulated. Whatever it is, name it without judgment. Second, respond with kindness and understanding rather than self-criticism. When you notice you are suffering, feeling inadequate, or unable to perform as expected, meet yourself with the same patience you would extend to a friend in the same situation. Not pity, not lowering standards, just recognition that struggle does not mean deficiency. Third, remember that difficulty is common, normal, and an inherent part of life. It is the friction that allows for growth. All difficulty is temporary. No single moment, experience, or emotion defines you. You are not your worst day. You are not your executive dysfunction. You are not your sensory overload. These are experiences, not identities. This threefold process becomes especially critical for neurodivergent individuals because the difficulty you experience is not randomly distributed. It is systemic, predictable, the result of operating in environments designed for different specifications. And this is where self-compassion intersects with self-awareness. Your operating system is different, not deficient. The incompatibility you feel is environmental, not internal. A square peg does not fit a round hole, but that does not make the peg broken. The struggle is real, but it is not pathological. You are not malfunctioning. You are functioning according to your specifications in a system optimized for a different set. Coherence is possible without becoming someone else. You do not need to fix yourself into roundness. You need to understand your actual shape and build environments where that shape functions. Self-compassion, in this context, means releasing the internalized belief that your neurodivergence is something to apologize for, overcome, or mask until you can approximate normalcy. It means recognizing that the years you spent struggling were not wasted because you were too weak or too broken to succeed. They were years spent in incompatible environments without the knowledge or language to understand why. That was not your fault, and it does not define your capacity for coherence now. Self-compassion is what allows you to stop fighting yourself and start building for yourself. Sovereignty. Sovereignty is not selfishness. It is not independence. It is not isolation. It is not rejecting all external structures or refusing to participate in shared systems. Sovereignty is self-possession, acquiring full ownership and maintaining agency over your own internal system, even when operating within external systems you did not design and cannot control. This means setting boundaries, not as aggression, but as necessity. Boundaries around your time, your energy, your attention, and your nervous system capacity. Boundaries that protect your ability to function rather than constantly compensating for environmental incompatibility. It means building structures that serve your actual needs rather than conforming to external demands that erode your coherence. Morning routines that allow regulation rather than rushing to meet arbitrary start times. Work processes that align with how your attention actually operates rather than pretending you can sustain focus like a neurotypical person. Communication styles that are honest about your limitations rather than performing competence you do not have. It means operating from your own specifications rather than waiting for accommodation. Not because accommodation is wrong, but because waiting for permission to function keeps you dependent. Sovereignty means you build your own square hole wherever possible, even if you must operate within round hole systems for income, education, or social obligation. And here is the reality that must be stated plainly. Sovereignty will ruffle feathers. When you stop masking, people will be uncomfortable. When you set boundaries, some will call you difficult. When you refuse to perform neurotypical operations, the systems designed and set up primarily for them will resist. Managers will question your commitment. Colleagues will complain about special treatment. Family members will tell you that you are being unreasonable, that everyone struggles, that you just need to try harder. Unfortunately, an individual operating with true inner coherence and sovereignty will always destabilise everything in the field around them that is not as. But that's okay. Not out of spite or arrogance, but because other people's comfort cannot be more important than your coherence. The majority of neurodivergent people operate within systems, schools, workplaces, families, social structures that were not designed for them. Sovereignty does not require you to leave those systems or burn them down from the inside after becoming radicalized and rebelling. It requires you to stop sacrificing your own functioning to make those systems comfortable. Those systems, and those within them that benefit from your involvement, benefit from one thing: your functioning. You, and you only, know how you function and how you function best. You making sure that you do so, unless you take my words the wrong way, is in everyone's best interests, so they'll soon get over it. This takes internal strength, of course. It requires knowing yourself well enough, self-awareness, to identify what you actually need. It requires treating yourself with enough respect, self-compassion, to believe those needs are legitimate. And it requires the willingness to assert those needs, internal sovereignty, even when doing so creates external friction. Some will understand, but it doesn't matter if none do, as long as you're able to reasonably adjust your life in the way that you need. Some will respect your boundaries once they see you mean them. Others will not, but that's their problem and not yours. Sovereignty means you no longer wait for external validation to operate according to your actual internal specifications. You do not ask permission to regulate your nervous system. You do not apologize for needing what you need. You do not perform coherence you do not have in order to make others comfortable with your presence. You build what you need to build. You set the boundaries required to maintain it, and you accept that some people will not like it, because the alternative, performing neurotypical function you do not have, sacrificing your regulation to maintain social harmony, waiting for systems to grant you permission to exist without your brakes on, is not sustainable nor smart. It is the path to burnout, breakdown, and perpetual passenger status in your own life, and perpetuation of pathology in your own and the collective's narrative. Sovereignty is what allows you to stop being a square peg trying to fit round holes and start being a square peg that carves a square hole for yourself, even within systems that remain fundamentally round. It is not comfortable, it is not always welcomed, but it is the only path to coherence that does not depend on someone else's permission. The 3 S's form the Rosetta Stone to coherence in the neurodivergent experience, the key that unlocks everything else in this book. Without them, the technical knowledge that follows, the brain networks, the neurotransmitters, the nervous system mechanics, remains abstract, interesting perhaps, but not actionable. With them, everything that follows becomes practical and usable, a manual for building your own coherence rather than waiting for someone else to grant it. Responsibility is not about blame, it is about power. The power to understand yourself fully, the power to build environments where you function, the power to stop being a passenger with all power externalized and start being a builder. The train has left the station, the round holes are permanent, the system will not save you, but you can save yourself. And that begins with integrating the Rosetta Stone. The Rider Decoded. The conscious self. The rider is your conscious awareness, the part of you that is reading these words right now, making decisions, setting intentions, directing attention. But the rider is not a single unified entity. It operates through 3 distinct brain networks, each with its own function, and the quality of your conscious experience, the continuation and sum of this being what we call a human life, from the individual's unique perspective, depends entirely on how these networks interact. For neurodivergent individuals, the rider operates differently. Not worse, not broken, differently. Understanding this difference is essential to building coherence, because every struggle you have experienced, every time you could not focus, every time you got distracted, every time you started something and could not finish, is the result of how your specific rider operates. This is not mere metaphor. This is neuroscience translated into archetypal language so you can actually use it. You can understand the rider as operating through 3 distinct networks, or as wearing one of 3 different hats at any moment, whatever works best for you. The CEO, the executive network. Out of the 3 primary networks the brain operates in, the executive network is the one most required in society. It's what I call the inner CEO. Its throne sits in the prefrontal cortex, exerting most of the brain's power in the frontal regions. The CEO is responsible for setting executive direction, focusing on execution towards that direction, and reaching completion. If you are reading this sentence with deliberate attention, you are doing so with your executive network, your inner CEO. Good job. The CEO's job is to be clear on your purpose and goals, discern what specific tasks are required, focus attention on those, inhibit distractions and impulses, plan and execute multi-step processes, maintain working memory, holding information in mind while using it, exercise social inhibition, the self-control required to function in society. Without your CEO, you are essentially a 3-year-old. No impulse control, no sustained attention, no ability to delay gratification or plan ahead. With a strong CEO, you are a mature, responsible, functioning member of human civilization. The education system is almost entirely designed to train this network. Though it does not do so accounting for any form of individual sovereignty, which is something that if a CEO lacks, she's nothing more than a puppet. Sit still, pay attention, complete tasks in sequence, follow instructions, ignore distractions. The entire industrial model of schooling and work assumes a functional, well-developed CEO. But the CEO alone cannot create insight, creativity, or breakthroughs. It can only focus and execute. For actual innovation, problem solving, and pattern recognition, the CEO relies on its literal opposite network, the default mode network. The inner lounge of geniuses, the default mode network. The default mode network is your brain's central lounge of geniuses and is the active hat on your rider when you are idling, resting passively, daydreaming, meandering mentally, and doing anything that does not require your complete executive attention. Your default mode network is your inner lounge of geniuses where, at every moment, Sun Tzu and Napoleon are strategizing, where Sherlock Holmes is analysing and laterally connecting disparate ideas, and where Leonardo is doodling, and where Jobs is telling Einstein he's not thinking big enough. Honestly, at all times, for all people, our inner parts doing their jobs. This is genuinely what the different regions of the DMN are doing in your brain, constantly trying out new neural connections, snapping them together like Lego bricks, testing combinations the CEO might find useful, all without any executive intention or involvement. The inner lounge of geniuses is responsible for pattern recognition and lateral thinking, autobiographical memory and self-referential thought, social cognition, theory of mind, understanding others' perspectives, creative problem solving and insight generation, and the internal narrative voices that you likely identify with as you in your head. I call this network the inner lounge of geniuses, as the default mode network is the network where breakthroughs originate, not from focused effort, but from the unconscious processing that happens when you are not actively trying to solve a problem. This is why solutions often appear in the shower, on walks, or just before sleep, when the CEO steps back and the lounge of geniuses can work freely. But just like the CEO, the inner lounge of geniuses on its own cannot produce functional outcomes. The lounge can generate brilliant ideas, but without the CEO to evaluate, refine, and execute them, they remain abstract musings. The key to breakthroughs, and to functional cognition generally, is network switching. When the CEO switches on, it alerts the lounge to its presence and sets direction. Right, you lot, we need to solve this specific problem. The lounge then gets to work, halting any aimless doodling and focusing its pattern recognition abilities on the CEO's request. When the CEO switches off, in sleep, rest, or mental wandering, the lounge returns to free exploration. Healthy cognition requires fluid movement between these two networks. Focus when needed, wandering when needed, execution and exploration in a balanced rhythm. For neurodivergent individuals, this switching is often disrupted. The CEO may struggle to stay online, the lounge may be too active, constantly pulling attention away, or the shadow, the third network, or hat, may be hijacking the entire system. The shadow, the salience network. The salience network operates beneath conscious awareness. It is the shadow, the subconscious mediator between the CEO and the lounge, directing your conscious attention to whatever it deems most important. The shadow's job is to monitor both internal and external environments for significance, detect novelty, pattern breaks, and emotionally stimulating information, direct attention to what is salient, important, urgent, pleasurable, or threatening, manage the switching between executive network and default mode network. The shadow prioritizes attention based on what is novel or out of the ordinary, emotionally stimulating, which visual imagery is particularly effective at triggering this, pattern breaking or unexpected, pleasurable or rewarding. This is why the child in class gets distracted when a bird lands on the tree outside her window. The shadow detected novelty and redirected attention. The child is not responsible for the distraction. The shadow, the salience network, is, because the bird was genuinely more interesting than whatever was being taught. So it's probably the teacher's fault, but I don't want to go there. For some people, the CEO can override the shadow when necessary. The CEO says, ignore the bird, focus on the lesson, and attention returns. But for neurodivergent individuals, particularly those with ADHD, the CEO is often weak or inconsistent. It cannot reliably override the shadow's directives, certainly not all of the time. This is the core neurodivergent distinction. When the CEO is underdeveloped or dysfunctional, the shadow becomes the dominant force. It directs attention based on novelty, emotion, and reward, not based on what the individual consciously wants to focus on. This is why neurodivergent individuals struggle with, quote, boring tasks, why they hyperfocus on interesting things but cannot sustain attention on necessary ones, and why distractions feel impossible to resist. The shadow is not malfunctioning, it is doing exactly what it is designed to do, directing attention to what is salient. But without a strong CEO to manage it, the shadow runs the show. This is why neurodivergent individuals often describe themselves as having no filter or being curiosity-driven. They are not weak-willed. They are not lazy. Their CEO cannot consistently override their shadow, and their shadow prioritizes novelty and emotion over obligation and necessity. Understanding this is essential because it reframes the struggle. You are not failing to focus because you are deficient. You are struggling because your CEO is weak and your shadow is strong, and industrial environments demand sustained CEO operation for 8 hours a day. The solution is not to try harder. The CEO does not get stronger through willpower. The solution is to build structures that work with your actual network dynamics rather than pretending you have a neurotypical rider. The normality of algorithmic manipulation and the embarrassing acceptance of the neural, biological, and evolutionary hijacking of our consciousness. Understanding the shadow's function, directing conscious attention to novelty, emotion, and reward, becomes especially critical when you recognise what modern technology is designed to do. And remember that our conscious attention and its lifetime accumulation is typically what most humans identify themselves with. Smartphones, social media, short-form content platforms like TikTok, pornography, and algorithmically curated feeds are not neutral tools. They are shadow exploitation systems. Every feature, every design choice, every algorithm is optimized to penetrate the inner lounge of geniuses, your default mode network, and trigger shadow, your salience network, as frequently and intensely as possible. This is not accidental, but intentional, sinister engineering. Infinite scroll ensures there is always something new, novelty. Short-form content provides chemical flushes before the CEO can even engage, reward without effort. Algorithmically curated feeds learn exactly what triggers your specific shadow and serve it endlessly, personalized salience. Pornography and erotic imagery hijack the shadow's evolutionary priority systems. Sexual novelty and reward are among the most potent salience triggers that exist. Notifications, likes, and comments all create unpredictable reward schedules, the most addictive pattern known to behavioral psychology. Every one of these mechanisms is designed to bypass the CEO and inner parts, your default mode network, entirely and speak directly to the unconscious shadow. And the shadow, doing exactly what it is designed to do, directs attention towards the stimuli, again and again and again. And here is the critical reality. Your brain cannot distinguish between real and not real. When you watch a video, scroll through images, or consume any digital content, your brain processes it as experience. The same neural pathways activate, the same neurochemicals are released, the same emotional responses trigger. Your shadow does not know the difference between a real social interaction and a parasocial relationship with someone on a screen, or a genuine accomplishment and watching someone else accomplish something in a video, or an actual sexual encounter and pornographic content, or a real threat and a manufactured outrage designed to capture attention. The stimulation is registered as real. The reward systems fire as though the experience actually happened to you. And critically, the grooves are carved as though the experience was real. This is why digital consumption is so insidious. It provides the neurochemical reward of real experience without any of the effort, risk, or consequence. Your brain gets the dopamine hit of social connection without actual vulnerability, the satisfaction of accomplishment without actual work, the sexual reward without actual intimacy. And because the brain cannot distinguish real from not real at the neurochemical level, these artificial experiences create the same neural pathways that real experiences would, except they are infinitely easier to access and can be accessed at any time you want in just a few finger taps, and are infinitely more intense than most real experiences have ever been in human history and could ever be in our real, actual worlds. This creates a devastating feedback loop. The more you consume artificial stimulation, the more your shadow becomes grooved to expect it, and the less capable you become of engaging with reality, which now feels comparatively boring, slow, effortful, and unrewarding. This creates grooves. Neural pathways strengthen with repetition. Every time the shadow directs attention to a notification, a new video, a dopamine triggering image or video, that pathway becomes more established. The more established a pathway, the more automatic the response. Eventually, reaching for your phone is not a conscious decision. It is a groove so deep that your hand moves before your CEO even registers the impulse. This is true for everyone, neurotypical and neurodivergent alike. But for neurodivergent individuals with weak CEOs, the impact is catastrophic. If your CEO struggles to override your shadow under normal conditions, it has no chance against systems specifically engineered to exploit the shadow's vulnerabilities. The CEO says, "Stop scrolling, you have work to do." The shadow says, "But look, novelty." The CEO loses every time. And the implications of this are only beginning to emerge. Entire generations are now being born into environments where shadow exploitation is the default. Children receive smartphones before their prefrontal cortex has even begun to develop. Before the CEO has any structural foundation, the shadow is being trained, grooved, to expect constant novelty, instant reward, and zero sustained effort. What does a brain look like when the shadow's grooves are carved before the CEO even comes online? The answer is, we do not fully know yet. But early evidence is disturbing. Attention spans collapsing across all age groups, but especially among those raised with smartphones. Inability to tolerate boredom or sustain focus without external stimulation. Executive function deficits appearing in populations with no prior neurodivergent diagnosis. Rising rates of anxiety, depression, and dysregulation correlating directly with screen time and social media use. Pornography exposure at progressively younger ages, rewiring sexual reward pathways before natural sexual development even begins, inserting malware into identity and behavioural loops. This is not moral panic. Again, this is neuroscience. And it is not my fault if this is only something you are now becoming awake to. The shadow is being systematically trained to prioritise algorithmically generated salience over internally generated goals. Again, bye-bye sovereignty and hello slaveness. And once those grooves are carved, they do not disappear easily. For neurodivergent individuals, this isn't a minor problem, it is an existential one. If your CEO was already weak, and modern environments have now trained your shadow to expect constant dopamine hits with zero effort, how do you ever build the capacity for sustained focus? How do you ever regulate when your baseline expectation is infinite novelty? How do you ever function in a world that still demands 8 hours of sustained executive function when your shadow has been grooved to reject anything that is not immediately rewarding? The honest answer is that it simply becomes exponentially harder, perhaps even impossible, without deliberate self-intervention. This is why sovereignty matters. You cannot wait for the system to protect you from these mechanisms, because the system profits from them. The system is them. Tech companies make billions by exploiting your shadow. Pornography platforms operate the exact same way. The entire digital economy is built on capturing and monetizing attention via shadow hijacking. If you want coherence, you must recognize that your environments, and no doubt most of your behaviors and pattern loops, are actively working against it. Every app on your phone is engineered to disrupt your CEO and capture your shadow. Every algorithm is optimized to carve grooves that make you more dependent on external stimulation and less capable of internal direction. The solution is not willpower or discipline. The CEO cannot out-willpower an algorithm designed by hundreds of engineers with billions in funding. The solution is structural boundaries, removing the mechanisms entirely, deleting apps, turning off notifications, creating friction between impulse and action, building environments where the shadow is not under constant assault. This is where understanding boundaries goes from being something that is only about other people and becomes something that's required first and foremost with yourself, for yourself, from yourself. At the end of the day, we are all animals on a rock, no? Last I checked, that was still true, despite our differentiation from the others we share it with. None of this is optional for neurodivergent individuals seeking coherence, or for those on the sidelines and intersections of the subject to integrate into their understanding and operations. It is foundational, because if your shadow is running the show for you, so your conscious self is not, or feels like it is not, and your shadow has been grooved to expect infinite novelty and instant reward, you will never build the capacity for sustained focus, regulation, or functional independence without boundaries between the programming and conditioning that is everywhere we look and touch in 2025 and beyond, and yourself. The grooves can be recarved. Neural plasticity is real, but it requires removing the mechanisms that carve the destructive grooves in the first place, and then deliberately building new ones through consistent, structured practice. This is hard. It is uncomfortable. And it is necessary. All of this is. Which is why I'm writing this, and hopefully why you're indeed reading it. The messengers. Neurotransmitters. The rider, with its CEO function, inner lounge, and shadow, operates through electrochemical signals. The networks do not communicate telepathically, they communicate via messengers, neurotransmitters, chemical compounds released by neurons that carry information across synapses. When your CEO focuses attention, messengers deliver that instruction. When your shadow detects novelty, messengers redirect your awareness. When your lounge generates insight, messengers carry it to consciousness. Every thought, every impulse, every shift in attention is a messenger in motion. For neurodivergent individuals, the messenger system operates differently. Not broken, different. Understanding this is essential because every struggle you have with focus, motivation, impulse control, or regulation is downstream of how your specific messengers function. Again, this is not metaphor, this is biochemistry, and it explains everything. The messenger of pursuit. Dopamine. Dopamine is not, as it is commonly misunderstood, the pleasure chemical. It is, in fact, the messenger most associated with motivation, reward anticipation, and the ability to pursue goals. Thus, it is more accurate to call it the pursuit of pleasure chemical. And critically, dopamine is released more during the pursuit than upon arrival. When you are moving toward a goal, anticipating the reward, working toward it, getting closer, dopamine floods the system. This is what creates the feeling of, I want that, and I'm going to get that. It is the neurochemical fuel for sustained efforts. But when you finally achieve the goal, dopamine drops, often dramatically. That is why achieving something you worked hard for can feel strangely empty. The pursuit was dopamine rich, the achievement itself is dopamine poor. This isn't a flaw, it is evolutionary design. Dopamine exists to drive behaviour toward goals, not to reward you for sitting still once you've achieved them. If dopamine spiked upon achievement and stayed high, you would have no motivation to pursue anything else. You would sit contentedly with your accomplishment, like acquiring food for your family, and starve when you are next called upon to do so, again, for argument's sake. Instead, dopamine drops after achievement, creating a void that demands, well, what's next? This is why you feel energized while working towards something, but deflated once it is done. The anticipation of a purchase is often more satisfying than the purchase itself. Scrolling social media, infinite novelty, constant pursuit, I will find something and it will be good and better, feels more compelling than completing actual tasks, finite achievement, dopamine crash, or making any actual decisions, having to accept and live with the reality of your choosing, controlling the messengers. Video games are so effective at capturing attention. They provide endless micro goals, constant dopamine hits from pursuit, with achievements that immediately generate new sets of goals. Understanding this distinction with dopamine, the messenger of pursuit, is essential for neurodivergent individuals because your dopaminergic system is already dysregulated, and modern environments are designed to exploit this exact mechanism regardless of your neurotype. Dopamine functions primarily in reward anticipation, the feeling that something desirable is possible to possess, which drives you to pursue it. Sustained effort, the neurochemical fuel that allows you to keep going even when the task is difficult. Focus and attention, working with the messenger of arousal, norepinephrine, to help the CEO maintain concentration on goal-directed behaviour. And movement and motor control. Dopamine pathways are also involved in physical coordination. When dopamine levels are optimal, you feel driven, capable of sustained effort, and able to delay gratification for meaningful rewards. Tasks feel achievable. Goals feel worth pursuing. The gap between I should do this and I am doing this closes. Without a functioning dopaminergic system, one of several fundamental systems all mammals share, having any agency, which is an essential part of sovereignty and coherence, in one's life can feel next to impossible. And for neurodivergent individuals, particularly those with ADHD, dopamine function is fundamentally different. ADHD brains do not produce less dopamine. The issue is more complex. Dopamine receptors may be less sensitive, requiring higher levels of stimulation to register reward. Dopamine reuptake happens faster, meaning the signal does not last as long. And baseline dopamine activity is lower in key regions, particularly in areas governing motivation and reward processing. This creates a specific pattern: low dopamine baseline with normal or high dopamine spikes. And what this means in practice is that tasks that are not immediately rewarding feel almost impossible to initiate. The dopamine signal for this is worth pursuing never arrives at sufficient strength. Boring tasks, no matter how important, cannot generate enough dopamine to sustain attention. The CEO tries to focus, but without dopamine support, the pursuit never actually begins. Or it may begin and then crash immediately because the dopamine system assists the shadow in conceding to the collapse by being the messenger that says, nah, this isn't worth it. Novel, stimulating, or high-stakes activities generate massive dopamine spikes, which is why neurodivergent individuals can hyperfocus on interesting things but struggle with necessary things. The dopamine is there, but only for certain types of pursuit. Delayed rewards do not motivate. If the reward is not immediate or emotionally salient enough, the dopamine signal will be too weak to drive behaviour. The pursuit feels pointless because the brain cannot generate sufficient anticipation for distant rewards. Completing tasks feels empty and unjustifiable. Even when you finish something important, the dopamine crash hits harder because your baseline was already low, and it wasn't fun to get to the finish line, leaving no neurochemical reward for achievement, only exhaustion and the question, why did I even bother? This is why ADHD is often better understood as a pursuit deficit disorder, rather than an attention deficit. It is not that you cannot pay attention. It is that your brain cannot generate sufficient dopamine to make uninteresting tasks to you feel worth pursuing to you at all times. And again, discipline and willpower does not fix this. Dopamine is not produced by trying harder. You cannot force your messengers to send more signals through sheer determination. The CEO can demand all that it wants. If dopamine, the messenger of pursuit, is not present to fuel said pursuits, the shadow will redirect attention to something that does generate dopamine instead. That is its job, and you can't sack it. This is also why modern technology is so devastating for neurodivergent individuals and why it is so successful in itself as technology. Every app, every algorithm, every notification is engineered to provide micro hits of dopamine through endless pursuit. Scrolling gives you the neurochemical experience of chasing something without ever having to sustain effort or tolerate the dopamine crash of completion. It is an infinite pursuit of a bottomless pit of nothing, with no achievement required or reached, so the pursuit never stops, and always knows that it could pursue more and more in between your real life. The brain, already dopamine deficient with a now programmed altered baseline, becomes dependent on these artificial sources, and real tasks, which require sustained pursuit toward delayed rewards, become neurochemically impossible. This is why stimulant medication works for ADHD. It increases dopamine availability, allowing the CEO to actually maintain focus on necessary tasks rather than being perpetually preemptively hijacked by the shadow seeking easier and usually spicier dopamine elsewhere. It does not make you superhuman, it makes you capable of neurotypical pursuit. But medication alone is not coherence. Coherence requires understanding that your entire system, messengers included, operates differently, and building structures that work with that reality rather than pretending you can operate and pursue goals the way neurotypical people do. The messenger of arousal, norepinephrine, also called noradrenaline. Norepinephrine is the messenger of alertness and readiness to respond, hence arousal. It is what keeps you awake, aware, and prepared to act. It works closely with the messenger of pursuit, dopamine, to support the CEO's ability to focus and sustain attention. But while dopamine drives pursuit, norepinephrine governs presence, the opposite of impatience. Whether you are alert enough to engage with what is in front of you or not. Norepinephrine functions in alertness and wakefulness, keeping you awake, aware, and cognitively available. Attention and focus, helping filter relevant information from irrelevant noise so the CEO can direct attention effectively. Stress response, activating fight or flight when threats are detected. And emotional arousal, the intensity with which you experience emotions, both positive and negative. Optimal norepinephrine levels create a state of calm alertness, awake, focused, responsive, but not anxious or hypervigilant. You are present, engaged, and capable of directing attention without effort. For neurodivergent individuals, norepinephrine dysregulation is common, particularly in ADHD and autism. When norepinephrine is too low, chronic fatigue and difficulty staying awake despite adequate sleep, brain fog, thoughts feel slow, processing feels laboured, inability to sustain attention even on interesting tasks, emotional flatness or difficulty experiencing intensity. The CEO simply cannot come online because the brain is not sufficiently aroused to support executive function. On the contrary, when norepinephrine is too high, hypervigilance and difficulty relaxing, constantly scanning for threats, unable to settle, anxiety, racing thoughts, constant internal tension, emotional hyperactivity, everything feels too intense, too urgent, too overwhelming, physical restlessness, inability to sit still, jitteriness. The shadow is overactive, redirecting attention to every potential threat or novelty. Many neurodivergent individuals oscillate between these extremes rather than maintaining a stable middle range. Too little norepinephrine makes focus impossible. The brain is simply not alert enough for the CEO to function. Too much makes regulation impossible. The shadow hijacks everything. The system is perpetually in threat detection mode and calm becomes unreachable. This is why many ADHD individuals describe needing crisis or deadline pressure to focus. The stress response artificially spikes norepinephrine, which temporarily brings the brain into the arousal range where the CEO can actually operate. Under normal conditions, norepinephrine is too low for sustained attention. Under pressure, it spikes high enough to override the shadow and allow focus. But this is not sustainable coherence. It is borrowing future regulation capacity to function now. The norepinephrine crash after the deadline passes is real, often manifesting as exhaustion, emotional volatility, or complete inability to engage with any further demands. This is also why stimulant medications that increase both dopamine and norepinephrine, like amphetamines, are effective for ADHD. They raise baseline arousal to the range where the CEO can actually function without requiring artificial crisis. But again, medication is not coherence. Coherence requires understanding that your arousal baseline is different and that expecting yourself to maintain neurotypical alertness and focus without the neurochemical support to do so is not failure of discipline and willpower, it is actually a structural impossibility. If your norepinephrine is too low, thus your messenger of arousal's capabilities, your CEO cannot come online no matter how hard you try. If it is too high, your shadow will dominate no matter how much you want to stay calm. The solution is not trying harder, it is building environments and structures that stabilize your arousal levels within your functional range. The messenger of stability. Serotonin. Serotonin is often called the mood stabilizer, though its functions extend far beyond mood. It is the messenger of emotional regulation, impulse control, and baseline contentment. Where the messenger of dopamine drives pursuit and the messenger of norepinephrine governs arousal, serotonin provides stability through steadiness, the foundation that allows you to tolerate frustration, delay gratification, and maintain emotional equilibrium even when circumstances are difficult. Serotonin functions in mood regulation, creating a stable baseline sense of well-being, not constant happiness but the absence of dramatic mood swings. Impulse control, helping the CEO inhibit impulsive behaviour and pause before reacting. Sleep-wake cycles. Serotonin is a precursor to melatonin, the hormone that governs circadian rhythms and sleep. Appetite and digestion. The gut produces the majority of the body's serotonin, influencing hunger, satiety, and digestive function. Social behaviour. Serotonin influences aggression, cooperation, social hierarchy navigation, and the ability to tolerate social friction without collapsing or exploding. Optimal serotonin creates emotional stability, not the absence of difficulty, but the capacity to experience difficulty without fragmentation. You can feel frustrated without rage, disappointed without despair, anxious without panic. The emotions exist, but they do not destabilize you, the rider, just because they do. For neurodivergent individuals, serotonin dysregulation contributes to emotional volatility, impulse control difficulties, and sleep disruption. Low serotonin is linked with depression, irritability, and emotional fragility. Small setbacks feel catastrophic. Minor frustrations trigger disproportionate emotional responses. Difficulty controlling impulses. Saying things without thinking. Reacting without pausing. Spending money impulsively. Eating impulsively. Acting on urges before the CEO can evaluate whether the action is wise. Obsessive or repetitive thought patterns. Rumination, intrusive thoughts, inability to let go of worries or perceived slights. Sleep disturbances, difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, or waking feeling rested because serotonin is a precursor to melatonin. Insufficient serotonin disrupts the entire sleep-wake cycle. Social withdrawal or aggression, either avoiding social interaction entirely or responding to social friction with disproportionate hostility. This is why SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are sometimes prescribed for neurodivergent individuals, particularly those with co-occurring anxiety, depression, or emotional dysregulation. By increasing serotonin availability, these medications can stabilize mood and improve impulse control, though they do not directly address dopamine-related attention and motivation issues or norepinephrine-related arousal problems. In fact, in the case of myself, I was wrongly diagnosed and medicated with anxiety and depression in my teens when my symptoms were being caused by my undiagnosed and untreated neurodivergence. So this is a real phenomenon that the individual can only find their answer to. For many neurodivergent individuals, emotional volatility is not a character flaw or a lack of maturity. It is a serotonin deficiency. The CEO cannot inhibit impulses because the messenger required for inhibition is not present in sufficient quantity. The emotional response happens before the CEO can intervene, and by the time conscious awareness and the ability to do anything with it catches up, the damage is done. The thing is said, the action is taken, the reaction has occurred. This creates a cycle of shame. You react impulsively, you regret it. You promise yourself, and maybe even others, that you will not do it again. And then it happens again, because the serotonin required to pause between impulse and action is still insufficient. Again, discipline and willpower does not fix this. The CEO cannot override neurochemistry. Low serotonin also explains why neurodivergent individuals often struggle with emotional recovery. A neurodivergent person with low serotonin experiences the same setback and cannot move on. The rumination is relentless. The emotional wound does not heal. The thought patterns loop endlessly because serotonin, the messenger of stability that allows you to let go of destabilization, is not present to facilitate that recovery process. Again, not weakness, biochemistry. And critically, serotonin is influenced by lifestyle factors in ways that the messenger of pursuit, dopamine, and the messenger of arousal, norepinephrine, are not. The messenger of stability, serotonin, production requires tryptophan, an amino acid from protein, sunlight exposure, which regulates our circadian systems, another mammalian one, physical movement, and gut health, since the gut produces most serotonin. This means that while you cannot willpower your way to more serotonin, you can influence serotonin levels through integrating the right understanding and structural changes. Eating adequate protein, getting sunlight exposure, particularly in the morning, moving your body regularly, and maintaining gut health. These are not cures, but they are levers that medication alone does not provide. For neurodivergent individuals seeking coherence, understanding the messenger of stability is essential because steadiness is a prerequisite for everything else. If you are unmoored, everything will destabilize you. If you cannot tolerate frustration, you cannot build resilience. If you cannot control impulses, you cannot maintain boundaries. If you cannot regulate mood, you cannot sustain relationships or work environments, or anything for that matter. So stability is not optional. It is, once again, foundational. And if your serotonin system operates differently, pretending you can achieve stability through effort alone, and by not understanding and integrating this knowledge, is not coherence. It is self-punishment by proxy of self-abandonment for a neurochemical reality you did not even choose. The messenger of constraint, GABA. GABA is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. While all prior messengers, dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, are excitatory, they activate neurons and drive activity, GABA does the opposite. It quiets, it constrains, it prevents overstimulation. This messenger is not about relaxation, it's the one that directly constrains consciousness. It's constantly filtering the overwhelming flood of information that could potentially enter conscious awareness and keeps your experience focused on immediate physical reality. It's the messenger of constraint that, in your reality, keeps the curtain up that stops God knows what else, and he probably does, in any potential, quote, wider reality from being part of your experiential reality. Again, not metaphysics, neurochemistry. Without GABA, your brain would be flooded. Every sensory input, every stray thought, every possible neural pathway would fire simultaneously. You would be unable to focus, unable to filter, unable to function. GABA is what allows the CEO to direct attention by silencing everything else. GABA functions in reducing neural excitability, constraining overactive circuits and preventing runaway stimulation, anxiety regulation. Insufficient GABA is directly linked to chronic anxiety, the feeling that the brain cannot settle because nothing is being inhibited. Sleep. GABA facilitates the transition from wakefulness to rest by constraining the systems that keep you alert. Muscle relaxation. GABA reduces physical tension, allowing the body to release somatically stored stress. And consciousness filtering. GABA constrains the scope of conscious awareness, keeping your brain tuned to your here and now rather than overwhelmed by the totality of possible perception. Optimal GABA creates the conditions for bounded awareness. The CEO can step back, the lounge can work freely. The shadow is not hypervigilant. You are awake but not wired, aware but not anxious, engaged but not overwhelmed, because the messenger of constraint system is successfully constraining what does not need your attention. For neurodivergent individuals, GABA deficiency is common and devastating. Low GABA manifests as chronic background anxiety, the feeling that something is always wrong, even when nothing specific is threatening. The brain cannot constrain the vigilance circuits. The inability to turn off the mind, racing thoughts, inability to stop thinking, mental loops that repeat endlessly without resolution because nothing is being inhibited. Difficulty transitioning from activity to rest. The CEO cannot step down. The shadow remains hypervigilant. Sleep becomes impossible even when the body is exhausted because the arousal systems are not constrained. Sensory overwhelm. Without sufficient inhibitory capacity, sensory input is not filtered. Everything comes through at full intensity. Lights are too bright, sounds are too loud, textures are unbearable because GABA is not constraining the sensory flood. Muscle tension and physical restlessness, jaw clenching, shoulder tension, inability to sit still. The soma mirrors the psyche's inability to constrain neural excitation. Emotional flooding. Without GABA to inhibit emotional circuits, feelings overwhelm, and what should be mild irritation becomes rage, what should be concern becomes panic, and all emotional responses remain unconstrained. This is why substances that increase GABA activity, alcohol, benzodiazepines, certain sleep aids, feel so profoundly relieving to neurodivergent individuals. They provide the constraint that the brain cannot generate on its own. The constant vigilance stops. The racing thoughts quiet. The physical tension releases. For the first time, the system feels bounded rather than flooded. But these are not sustainable solutions. They create dependency. They do not address the underlying GABA deficiency, and they come with significant costs. Cognitive impairment, tolerance, withdrawal, and in the case of benzodiazepines, genuine danger. GABA deficiency also explains why neurodivergent individuals often describe feeling like too much is coming through. The quote normal brain constrains sensory input, emotional intensity, and cognitive stimulation so that only the most relevant information reaches conscious awareness. GABA is a primary mechanism for that constraint. And when GABA is insufficient, the constraint weakens. More gets through. Everything feels louder, brighter, more intense, and more urgent. This isn't a metaphor. This is what happens when inhibitory capacity is reduced. The brain becomes less able to constrain what enters awareness. Sensory processing disorders, emotional hyperreactivity, racing thoughts, inability to ignore distractions physically and not respond to them emotionally. These are all downstream effects of insufficient constraint. And in extreme states, near-death experiences, certain altered states of consciousness, moments of profound insight or terror, GABA activity drops dramatically. The normal constraints on awareness dissolve. Information that is usually filtered becomes accessible. I describe this as the curtain being pulled back, a perception of reality beyond the narrow bandwidth that normal GABA activity maintains. This is why psychedelics, which reduce inhibitory mechanisms, produce such profound alterations in consciousness. This is why meditation traditions that quiet the mind report accessing states of awareness unavailable in ordinary waking consciousness. This is why trauma, which dysregulates GABA, can create dissociative states where the boundaries of self and reality become fluid and often destabilizing. GABA does not just calm you, it defines the boundaries of your conscious experience. For neurodivergent individuals with chronically low GABA, these boundaries are already weakened. The constraint is already compromised. You are already experiencing more than the system was designed to process. And industrial environments, constant stimulation, no downtime, perpetual demands on attention provide no opportunity for the system to recover. This is why burnout for neurodivergent individuals is not just exhaustion, but nervous system collapse. The GABA deficient brain, already operating without sufficient inhibitory capacity, finally cannot maintain even minimal constraint, leading to burnout. Everything floods in, nothing can be ignored, and coherence becomes impossible. This is not weakness, this is a structural neurochemical reality. And pretending you can function in high stimulation environments without sufficient GABA is not coherence, it's a path to breakdown. The messenger of ignition, glutamate. Glutamate is the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter. Where GABA constrains, glutamate ignites. It activates neurons, drives cognitive processing, facilitates learning, and creates the conditions for neural plasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize, adapt, and form new pathways. Glutamate is the messenger of action, activation, and change. Every time you learn something new, every time a neural pathway strengthens, every time your brain rewires itself in response to experience, glutamate is the spark behind it. Glutamate functions in learning and memory formation, strengthening synaptic connections, the grooves I discussed earlier in the context of algorithmic manipulation and neural hijacking, cognitive processing, activating neural circuits for thought, perception, analysis, and decision-making, neural plasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself, form new connections, and adapt to new demands, sensory processing, glutamate is involved in transmitting sensory information from receptors to the brain. Motor function, coordinating movement and physical response. Optimal glutamate creates the conditions for learning, adaptation, and cognitive flexibility. Your brain can respond to new information, it can form new patterns, it can change. But glutamate is not benign. In fact, too much glutamate is neurotoxic. When glutamate levels become excessive, neurons become overstimulated to the point of damage or, in rare cases, even death. This is called excitotoxicity, and it is associated with chronic stress and anxiety, overactive neural circuits that cannot shut down, sensory overload and overwhelm, too much stimulation, insufficient inhibition, GABA, to counterbalance the excitation, neuroinflammation, the brain's inflammatory response to excessive excitation, which further impairs function, neurodegenerative conditions in extreme cases. Prolonged excitotoxicity contributes to conditions like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and other forms of neural degeneration. Glutamate and GABA exist in opposition. Glutamate ignites, GABA constrains. A healthy brain maintains balance between the two. Enough excitation to learn and respond, enough inhibition to prevent overload. For neurodivergent individuals, this balance is often severely dysregulated. Too much glutamate relative to GABA creates a brain that is perpetually overstimulated. Neural circuits fire too easily, too intensely, and too frequently. The system cannot quiet. The constraint mechanisms are overwhelmed by the ignition mechanisms. This manifests as sensory sensitivities. Sensory input ignites neural pathways with excessive intensity, and there is insufficient GABA to constrain the response. Lights are blinding, sounds are painful, textures are intolerable, the touch of anything on you is disconcerting. Emotional overwhelm. Emotional circuits ignite disproportionately to the stimulus, and the brain cannot inhibit the response, which should be mild frustration, becomes explosive rage because the ignition is too strong and the constraint is too weak. Inability to filter stimuli. Every input ignites a response. The brain cannot prioritize, cannot ignore, cannot filter. Everything demands attention because glutamate is activating everything and GABA is not constraining anything. Racing thoughts and mental hyperactivity. Cognitive circuits fire continuously without pause. Thoughts ignite thoughts which ignite thoughts, and the system has no mechanism to stop the cascade. Physical restlessness and hyperactivity. Motor circuits are overactive. The body cannot settle. Movement feels compulsive because the ignition systems are dominant. This is why sensory processing disorders are so common in autism and ADHD. It is not just that sensory information is processed differently, it is that the brain lacks sufficient inhibitory capacity, GABA, to quiet the excitatory overload, glutamate. Every sensory input ignites a neural response. In a neurotypical brain, GABA constrains that response so only the most relevant stimuli reach conscious awareness. In a GABA deficient, glutamate dominant neurodivergent brain, everything ignites, nothing is constrained. This is exhausting. It is not sustainable, and it is why neurodivergent individuals describe sensory environments as physically painful rather than merely uncomfortable. The pain is real. The neurocircuits are being overstimulated to the point of damage. Glutamate also explains why learning and neuroplasticity are double-edged for neurodivergent individuals. Glutamate facilitates the formation of grooves, neural pathways that strengthen with repetition. This is how habits form. This is how skills develop. This is how the brain adapts. But if your glutamate system is overactive, grooves form too easily and too deeply. This is why negative thought patterns, rumination, catastrophizing, self-criticism become so entrenched. The glutamate ignites the pathway, and without sufficient GABA to constrain it, the groove deepens with every repetition. Addictive behaviors, scrolling, gaming, pornography, create such powerful dependencies. The glutamate response to the stimulus is disproportionately strong, carving grooves that feel impossible to escape when triggered, and are certainly impossible to replicate in the real world. Traumatic memories remain so vivid and intrusive. The glutamate activity during the traumatic experience was excessive, creating grooves so deep that the memory cannot be inhibited. Again, none of this is a failure of discipline and willpower. This is glutamate dominance creating grooves faster and deeper than the system can manage. The balance between glutamate and GABA is foundational to coherence. If glutamate is too high and GABA is too low, you are perpetually ignited with no capacity to constrain. You are overwhelmed, overstimulated, unable to filter, unable to rest, unable to regulate. The solution is not to eliminate glutamate. It is essential for learning, adaptation, and function, but to restore balance. This requires reducing unnecessary stimulation, removing the mechanisms that constantly ignite glutamate responses, increasing GABA support through supplements, lifestyle changes, or medication where necessary, allowing a natural baseline to be reached, resting in non-involvement in the perpetual cycles and systems you could get a break from, building structures that prevent glutamate dominance, downtime, sensory-friendly environments, rhythms that allow the system to recover. For neurodivergent individuals, pretending you can tolerate the same levels of stimulation, the same cognitive demands, the same sensory environments as neurotypical people is not coherence. It is ignoring the reality that your glutamate-GABA balance operates differently, and that difference has real, physical consequences. Understanding the messengers, indeed all of them, reframes every struggle you have experienced into a new coherent framework of neurological and neurochemical understanding through an archetypal lens. You are not weak, you are not broken, your neurochemical system operates according to different specifications, and industrial environments demand specifications you do not have. And it is not your fault that nobody taught you any of this up until now. The solution is not to force yourself into neurotypical patterns. The solution is to build coherence around your actual messenger dynamics rather than pretending they are something they are not. This is what the rest of this book will teach you how to do. Once you've understood and integrated the full framework behind the actual operating system and specifications that are underlying this entire thing. The Gatekeeper. Thalamus and sensory processing. The gatekeeper sits at the center of your brain, filtering every piece of sensory information before it reaches conscious awareness. Its scientific name is the thalamus, but its function is better understood through its role. It decides what gets through and what gets blocked. Every sensation you experience, every sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, passes through the gatekeeper first. It evaluates, it prioritizes, it filters. Only the information deemed most relevant is allowed to proceed to the cortex where conscious processing occurs. Everything else is suppressed, held at the threshold, kept out of awareness. This is not optional. Without the gatekeeper, you would be flooded. Every sensory input from every receptor in your body would demand attention simultaneously. You would be paralyzed by information overload, unable to function, unable to focus, unable to distinguish signal from noise. The gatekeeper acts as sensory relay station. All sensory information, except smell, which has a direct pathway, passes through the thalamus before reaching the cortex. Filter and prioritizer, determining what is relevant and what can be ignored based on context, salience, and current demands. Attention director, working with the shadow salience network to direct conscious awareness toward what matters most. Gating mechanism, literally opening and closing pathways to allow or block sensory information from reaching conscious awareness. In a neurotypical brain, the gatekeeper operates efficiently. Irrelevant stimuli are filtered out. Background noise remains in the background. The hum of fluorescent lights does not register. The texture of clothing is not noticed. The distant conversation stays distant. Conscious awareness receives only what is necessary. For neurodivergent individuals, the gatekeeper operates differently. The gate is stuck open, or it opens and closes erratically, or it prioritizes the wrong stimuli. The filter that should block irrelevant sensory input is compromised, and everything floods through. For example, it should be aiding your focus on a task at hand, but instead it allows the slight feeling of your jumper on your right shoulder blade to keep irritating you. That was literally what was just happening with me as I was writing that. Very helpful, gatekeeper. This is a sensory processing disorder, not a psychological issue, not a behavioural problem, a gating problem. And when the gatekeeper fails to gate effectively, Background noise becomes foreground. The hum of the refrigerator, the flicker of lights, the rustle of fabric, the person on the desk behind you eating their morning apple, the person on the desk beside you swallowing their water, all demanding attention with equal intensity. Textures are unbearable. Clothing tags, seams, certain fabrics feel like sandpaper or knives because the tactile input is not being gated, all making their way to conscious awareness at full intensity. Lights are blinding, fluorescent lighting, screens, sunlight, all feel overwhelming with the visual input not being modulated effectively. Sounds are painful, sudden noises, overlapping conversations, high-pitched tones, all triggering disproportionate distress with the auditory input not being filtered appropriately. Crowded environments are unbearable, too many simultaneous inputs, sights, sounds, smells, movements, and the gatekeeper cannot prioritize. Everything comes through, nothing can be ignored, leaving a minefield labyrinth to navigate ahead. This is not sensitivity in the emotional sense, though it's no doubt obvious how it can lead to that, but neurological reality. The thalamus is not gating effectively, and sensory information that should be suppressed is reaching conscious awareness at full volume. The gatekeeper's failure gets further compounded by the messenger of ignition, glutamate, messenger of constraint, GABA, imbalance. Remember, glutamate ignites neural circuits. GABA constrains them. In neurodivergent brains with low GABA and high glutamate, sensory inputs ignite responses with excessive intensity and there is insufficient inhibition to quiet them. The gatekeeper is supposed to filter at the entry point, but even if it tries, the downstream response is still disproportionate because the messengers themselves are dysregulated. Sensory input that gets through the gate immediately ignites glutamate-driven circuits, and without sufficient GABA to constrain the response, the experience is overwhelming. This is why sensory sensitivities worsen under stress, fatigue, or overstimulation. The gatekeeper's filtering capacity is not fixed. It degrades when the nervous system is taxed. The more depleted you are, the less effectively the thalamus can gate, and the more sensory input floods through unfiltered. This also explains why neurodivergent individuals need recovery time after sensory-heavy environments, which most typical environments are. It is not psychological exhaustion, it is neurological depletion. The gatekeeper has been operating in overdrive, trying and failing to filter an overwhelming volume of input. The system needs time to restore gating capacity. Without that recovery, the next sensory environment becomes even more unbearable because the filter is already compromised. This is why just push through is not functional advice. You are not being asked to tolerate discomfort. You are being asked to function while your sensory gating system is actively failing. That is not a matter of effort, it is a structural impossibility. Understanding the gatekeeper reframes sensory sensitivities entirely. You are not too sensitive. Your gatekeeper is not filtering effectively, and sensory input that should be suppressed is reaching conscious awareness at full intensity. This is not a character flaw. It is not immaturity. It is not attention seeking. It is a thalamic gating issue, compounded by glutamate GABA imbalance, made worse by environments that provide no opportunity for recovery. The solution is not desensitization. The solution is environmental design and sensory management, reducing unnecessary sensory input, creating sensory-friendly spaces, allowing recovery time, using tools, noise-cancelling headphones, soft fabrics, sunglasses, that reduce the load on an already compromised gatekeeper. This is not accommodation in the sense of inclusion and making things easier. This is working with your actual neurology rather than pretending your gatekeeper functions like a neurotypical one. Coherence requires accepting that if your sensory gating is different, you cannot tolerate the same environments neurotypical people can. And pretending otherwise is not strength, it is a path to breakdown. The encoder, the hippocampus and memory. The encoder is responsible for taking your experiences and converting them into memory. A seahorse-shaped structure deep in the brain, the hippocampus, that encodes new information so you can retrieve it later. Every experience you have, every conversation, every task, every moment of learning, must pass through the encoder to become memory. Without it, nothing sticks. You would experience the present, but the present would not become the past, and you would be perpetually starting from zero. The encoder functions in 2 stages. Stage 1, the encoding itself. When you are on task, actively engaged with something, the hippocampus is taking in information. It is creating packets of connected neurons, linking sensory details, emotional context, spatial information, and factual content into a coherent unit that will become memory. This happens mostly unconsciously. You are not aware that encoding is occurring. You are simply experiencing. But in the background, the encoder is working, capturing the experience and preparing it for storage. Stage 2, the consolidation. When you stop doing what you were doing, when you go off task, rest, or sleep, the hippocampus replays the experience. It strengthens the neural connections. It moves the memory from temporary storage, working memory, into long-term storage where it can be retrieved later. This is why sleep is essential for memory. The hippocampus does its most intensive consolidation work during sleep, particularly during REM cycles. If you do not sleep, or if sleep is disrupted, memories do not consolidate properly. You experience the thing, but you cannot remember it. The encoder also seems to be involved in the origin of thought. Thoughts do not appear randomly. They emerge from the hippocampus during off-task moments, when you are resting, daydreaming, or between activities, the rider switching networks or hats. Almost as if the inner lounge, your default mode network, uses the hippocampus as its pigeonhole. The hippocampus processes recent experiences, makes connections, and when a certain threshold is reached, the thought makes its way to the lounges, the default mode network's pigeonhole, for the CEO, executive network, to review. Crazy, right? Again, my archetypal framework aside, this is factual neuroscience. This is why insights often arrive when you are not actively thinking. The encoder has been working in the background, encoding and consolidating, and when a pattern completes, the thought can emerge into consciousness. For neurodivergent individuals, the encoder operates differently in several critical ways. Encoding is disrupted by attention issues. The hippocampus can only encode what you are actually paying attention to. If the CEO cannot sustain focus, if the shadow keeps redirecting attention to novelty, the encoder does not receive coherent information to encode and does not achieve cohesive enough calm in the in-between stages of the brain's network switching to consolidate. You were physically present, you heard the words, but your attention was fragmented. The hippocampus encoded pieces, but not the whole. Later, when you try to remember, the memory is incomplete or absent entirely. This is not a memory problem, it is an attention problem that creates a memory problem. The encoder is fine, the input and the in-between was compromised. This is why neurodivergent individuals often describe forgetting things they were told or taught. The issue is not retrieval failure, it is encoding and consolidation failure. It is the encoder's failure. This language that allows for a degree of depersonalization is paramount. The memory was never properly formed because states of attention and calm were never sustained long enough for the encoder to capture it and consolidate it in the first place. Consolidation is disrupted by sleep issues. Neurodivergent individuals, particularly those with ADHD and autism, have notoriously poor sleep. Difficulty falling asleep, difficulty staying asleep, difficulty waking rested, circadian rhythm disruptions. If sleep is compromised, consolidation is also compromised. The encoder cannot do its work. Memories and their lessons that should have been strengthened and moved to long-term storage remain fragile or disappear entirely. You experienced a thing, you even paid attention, but you did not sleep well, so the memory did not consolidate. The next day, it feels like it never happened. This is why neurodivergent individuals often feel like they are constantly relearning things. The encoding happened, the consolidation did not. The memory and its lessons never solidified. Emotional intensity disproportionately affects encoding. The hippocampus works closely with the amygdala, the brain's emotion center. Emotionally intense experiences are encoded more strongly because the amygdala signals this matters. For neurodivergent individuals with emotional hyperreactivity, low levels of the stability messenger, serotonin, and high levels of the ignition messenger, glutamate, everything feels emotionally intense. The amygdala is constantly signaling importance. The hippocampus, as the encoder, encodes accordingly. This creates a memory profile where emotionally charged moments are remembered in vivid, intrusive detail. Neutral or boring information is barely encoded at all. Traumatic experiences are over-encoded, creating grooves so deep the memories cannot be suppressed. This is why neurodivergent individuals often describe having excellent memory for some things, conversations that upset them, moments of embarrassment, perceived failures, and terrible memory for others, appointments, names, instructions. It is not inconsistency. It is the encoder responding to emotional salience. High emotion equals strong encoding. Low emotion equals weak or absent encoding. The encoder relies on the amygdala's signals. Working memory limitations compound encoding issues. Working memory is the temporary holding space where information lives while you are using it. It is what allows you to remember a phone number long enough to dial it or hold multiple steps of a task in mind while executing them. The encoder relies on working memory to hold information during the encoding process itself. If working memory capacity is limited, which it often is in ADHD, the encoder cannot hold enough information at once to form coherent memories. You start a task, you remember step 1, by the time you are on step 3, step 1 is gone. The hippocampus tried to encode, but working memory could not hold the sequence long enough for encoding to complete. This is why multi-step tasks feel impossible. Not because you do not understand them, but because your working memory cannot hold the steps long enough for the encoder to process them into retrievable memory. The encoder also governs spatial memory and navigation. The hippocampus is not just about remembering events. It also encodes spatial information, where you are, where things are in relation to where you are, and how to navigate accordingly. Neurodivergent individuals often describe poor spatial memory, forgetting where they parked, getting lost in familiar places, struggling with directions, or they simply refer to the various bumps and bruises they routinely pick up, thanks to their bumping into door frames, etc. This is not mere clumsiness or lack of physical or athletic capabilities. This is hippocampal. The encoder is not just failing to consolidate event memories, it is also failing to consolidate spatial information for you in real time. Understanding the encoder reframes forgetfulness and clumsiness entirely. You are not careless. You are not irresponsible. You are not lazy. Your hippocampus is doing its job, but attention issues prevent coherent encoding, and sleep issues hinder appropriate consolidation. Emotional dysregulation creates disproportionate encoding of charged moments compared to the more mundane and routine. Working memory limitations prevent multi-step information from being held long enough to encode as data that can be used effectively. Spatial encoding and navigation is fundamentally compromised. The solution is not try to remember better. The encoder does not respond to effort. The solution is building external systems that compensate for encoding and consolidation failures and allow for that reality to be real enough that it is not a problem nor pathologized. Write things down immediately. Use reminders. Create visual cues. Build routines that do not rely on memory. Prioritize sleep above almost everything else because without consolidation, nothing sticks. This is not accommodation. This is working with your actual neurology rather than pretending your encoder functions like a neurotypical one. Coherence requires accepting that if your operating system encodes, consolidates, and navigates differently, you cannot rely on memory and expect to utilize your brain in the same way neurotypical people do. And pretending otherwise is not discipline or having a higher standard, it is setting yourself up for repeated failure and thus stupidity and insanity in equal measure. The horse. Nervous system as extension of the rider who cannot leave his horse. The horse is your body, not just flesh and bones, but the entire autonomic nervous system, the network of signals that governs everything happening beneath conscious awareness. Heart rate, breathing, digestion, muscle tension, temperature regulation, immune response, all of it operates through the horse. The rider, your conscious awareness operating through the CEO, lounge, and shadow, sits atop the horse. The rider can direct, suggest, and receive signals, but the rider does not control the horse directly. The horse responds to its own signals, its own imperatives, its own state. And critically, the horse's state determines whether the rider can function at all. If the horse is dysregulated, heart racing, breathing shallow, muscles tense, system flooded with stress hormones, the CEO cannot come online. The lounge cannot process. The shadow dominates as the ruler of you. No amount of willpower changes this because the rider does not have direct access to the mechanisms that regulate the horse. The horse operates through the autonomic nervous system, which has two primary branches: the sympathetic activation branch and parasympathetic rest and restoration branch. The sympathetic branch, activation. The sympathetic system is the horse's accelerator. It prepares the body for action, fight, flight, or pursuit. When activated, heart rate increases, breathing quickens, becoming shallower, blood flow redirects to muscles and away from digestion, pupils dilate, stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, flood the system. The body is primed for immediate response. This is adaptive in short bursts. When genuine threat exists, sympathetic activation allows survival. But chronic sympathetic activation, which is common in neurodivergent individuals, is devastating. When the horse is stuck in sympathetic mode, the CEO struggles to come online. Executive functions fail because the system is prioritizing survival, not planning or execution that requires delayed gratification, as the horse requires gratification in order to know it's safe. The shadow is hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats and redirecting attention to every potential danger. This is not the same as planning, this is preempting. The gatekeeper fails. Sensory input floods through because the system cannot filter while in threat mode. The encoder struggles. Memory consolidation is impaired under chronic stress. The messengers are dysregulated. Cortisol suppresses dopamine, the messenger of pursuit, and serotonin, the messenger of stability, making focus and steadiness next to impossible. This is why just calm down is not functional advice. The rider cannot command the horse into parasympathetic mode. The horse responds to signals from the environment and the body, not from conscious intention. The parasympathetic branch, rest and restoration. The parasympathetic system is the horse's brake. It activates rest, digestion, recovery, and regulation. When activated, heart rate slows, breathing deepens, digestion resumes, muscles relax, stress hormones decrease, and the system enters a state where repair and consolidation can occur. This is where the CEO can function optimally. This is where the lounge does its best work. This is where the gatekeeper can filter effectively, and this is where the encoder consolidates memory. But parasympathetic activation requires safety. Not just the absence of threat, but the presence of signals that communicate you are safe, you can rest, you do not need to be vigilant. For neurodivergent individuals, parasympathetic activation is more often than not entirely inaccessible, especially when attempting to fit and function within a round hole. The system has been in sympathetic mode for so long, years of incompatible environments, chronic stress, sensory overload, emotional dysregulation, that the horse does not know how to shift into rest mode even when external threats are technically absent. This is known as polyvagal dysregulation. The vagus nerve, which governs parasympathetic rest and restoration activation, is stuck. The horse cannot brake. It can only accelerate or freeze. The freeze response, shut down. There is a third nervous system state, less discussed but critically important, called dorsal vagal shutdown. When the sense of threat is overwhelming, or safety is not familiar, and the idea of escape, or the ability to have agency and sovereignty appears impossible, the horse does not fight or flee. It freezes. Energy collapses inwards and the entire system shuts down to conserve resources and minimize harm. This is adaptive in extreme circumstances, like playing dead when a predator attacks. But chronic freezing is debilitating, and a maladaptive trait in 2025 and beyond, when there should be no real lions at your door. When the horse is stuck in freeze mode, the CEO is offline entirely. You cannot think coherently, plan effectively, or execute efficiently. The lounge is inaccessible. No processing, no insight, no creativity or joyous expansion in any form is possible. The body feels heavy, immobile, and disconnected from any field of okayness. Motivation disappears. The dopaminergic system, responsible for the messengers of pursuit, is entirely suppressed. Everything feels impossible and implausible. This is not laziness. This is nervous system collapse. Dysfunction in its realist sense, with all pathologizing language aside. The horse has determined that the environment is so threatening that the only option is shut down. Nervous system shutdown is the closest thing to temporary death one can experience. My stance on this is an iteration from the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer's, who defined life and a living organism as something that tries to affect and change its environment outside of its internal one, like a spiral that has its head spiraling outwards and its tail at the innermost point of the spiral, not the opposite, which is what inwards means. In a state of nervous system freeze, the surrender has already succeeded. There will be no change until the state is over. Burnout and chronic nervous system shutdown is a very real and heartbreaking phenomenon of learned helplessness. For neurodivergent individuals, freezing is often mistaken for many things, but not cooperating, childishness, being too emotional, depressive or unmotivated, to name but a few. But remember, it is autonomic, involuntary and unconscious. The horse is protecting you by conserving energy in the face of what it perceives as insurmountable threat. The neurodivergent horse operates differently. Neurodivergent nervous systems tend towards a baseline of sympathetic activation dominance. The horse is stuck in fight, flight, and pursuit by default, making regulation difficult and stopping for any form of rest along the way nearly impossible. Difficulty accessing parasympathetic rest and restoration activation. Even in safe environments, the horse cannot shift into rest mode because the signals required for safety are not being received or interpreted correctly, which is why this branch takes real training and practice in order to, quote, come online. Frequent oscillation between sympathetic, fight, flight, pursuit activation and dorsal shutdown, freeze. The system swings between hypervigilance and collapse, with no stable middle ground. Heightened sensitivity to environmental cues. The horse responds disproportionately to stimuli that neurotypical systems would filter or ignore. This is not a character flaw, this is autonomic dysregulation, and it is structural. The rider cannot fix this through willpower. The CEO cannot command the horse into coherence. The horse responds to body-based signals, breath, movement, touch, rhythm, safety cues from the environment and from other nervous systems through co-regulation. What this means for coherence. If your horse is dysregulated or having to operate in ways that are not suitable and sustainable, nothing else works. The rider cannot function, the messengers are compromised, the gatekeeper fails, the encoder struggles. A prerequisite to coherence is that the horse be regulated first. Not perfectly, not constantly, but baseline regulation must be achievable for anything else to function. As coherence requires all parts of one's specifications, the rider, the messengers, the gatekeeper, the encoder, the horse, to not only be functioning, but be in alignment. This is why without this knowledge, and crucially, the Rosetta Stone of the 3 S's, self-awareness, self-compassion and sovereignty, from all peoples of all neurotypes, none of this can be understood, integrated and achieved. This means we build and operate within a world where we begin prioritizing nervous system regulation over performance and productivity. If the horse is in sympathetic or freeze mode, no amount of effort will produce functional output, and all function and output is downstream from nervous system regulation anyway. Building environments that signal safety to all, reducing sensory overload, creating predictability, removing unnecessary chronic stressors, which is most of them. Using body-based regulation tools whenever needed, regardless of the systems we operate within, allowing singular focus on breath, movement, touch and rhythm, mechanisms that communicate directly with the horse rather than trying to override it with conscious intention. And recognizing when regulation is not possible and allowing rest. Sometimes the horse needs to freeze, and allowing the shutdown and creating conditions for recovery is the only path forward. Pretending your horse operates like a neurotypical one is not coherence, it is denial, and it leads to burnout and breakdown and eventually falling out of the system and society entirely. Pretending that the round holes in society and our incessant personal need to raise awareness and discuss inclusion of the square pegs in them is anything but distracting from the real issue, indeed the real epidemic, that is the dysphoria that prevails when the square pegs give up after trying, time and time again, is also denial but in a more insidious outfit. Understanding the horse reframes everything. There is no such thing as weakness or broken here. Only pathology. Every human is different, and some operate with one set of specifications and some with another. That is fine, and indeed a beautiful byproduct of our species. It is our medieval and industrial environments, and the fear, rigidity and reluctance to change in the leaders amongst us, of which, unfortunately, works well alongside the reluctance for coherence and reticence to honesty and sovereignty from the neurodivergent, that provides the perpetuation of the zero state of conditions required for regulation and functionality for all, and a dysphoria and dejection that is so rife which permeates across all generations today in a way unprecedented and agreeable to all who are reading this. The solution is not anything we've already tried, otherwise something would have worked. The solution is us all working with our horses and our own individual specifications rather than against them at the collective level. Part 3. The way of what is to come. Why the world we built and the path we're not even on is failing us. Part 1 deconstructed the mythology that has muddied our waters for too long. Part 2 gave you the technical manual for coherence, neurodivergent or not. Now I will address the world we inhabit as it stands today, and then turn our attention to a conclusion of practicalities. This chapter is not about blame. It is also not about victimhood. This is about a clear-eyed assessment of the environments we are expected to function within and why they, and us in our ignorance of all of this, are fundamentally flawed, also we can burst this bubble of movements that get us nowhere once and for all, replacing it with coherence, thus stopping us pretending that adaptation is possible and liberating us to the potential of alternatives. The convergence collision of our timeline with Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and superhuman technology. Human beings evolved over hundreds of thousands of years as the bipedal mammals we are that lived within the cyclical ecosystems around us in small nomadic groups. Our brains, our nervous systems, our social structures, our entire ways of being all emerged and optimized for environments that no longer exist. We have Paleolithic emotions, fear responses designed in our cave-dwelling days for immediate physical threats, with reward systems calibrated for scarcity, and social instincts built for tribes where, across an entire human life, one would not encounter and interact with more than 150 others. Our institutions are medievally inherited, at best, hierarchical power structures, monarchies, a species split into disparate concepts of nation states and lines on maps, compulsory systems designed for control and conformity, rules created centuries ago that persist because dismantling them would require admitting they were never optimal. Meanwhile, all, and I mean all, dramas and conflicts, geopolitical, military, interpersonal, relational, racial, religious, etc., that we have the quote pleasure of tuning into everywhere we go and look, an ability also unprecedented and not without its own implications, are also all inherited. Again, most definitely all, from prophecies and mythologies somehow still playing out today that were set in motion aeons ago and kept in motion by barbaric backwards pockets, though I wish it were indeed just pockets, of, again, medieval at best, peoples across the world, all in the name of divinity, transcendence, and togetherness, although they've never once demonstrated that they really believe themselves, each on the individual level enough to matter the togetherness and divinity part. Anyway, good luck to them. And we live amongst and connected to superhuman technology that our brains, nervous systems, and consciousnesses did not develop to deal with, and do not know how to. Infinite connectivity, constant stimulation, algorithmic manipulation, information overload that no previous generation ever faced. These three layers do not integrate, yet in the present day and beyond, they continue to converge and they are colliding with full force, with implications most would rather remain ignorant to. And neurodivergent individuals, an increasing portion of our species population, whose riders, messengers, gatekeepers, encoders, and horses already operate differently, are truly, simply, overwhelmingly, and undeniably crushed in that collision. Yet no awareness, up until now has been shed on this fact. Consciousness evolution meets environmental pressure. Human consciousness, that which is conscious, the riders, within us all, the horses, that is aware it is within us, and is aware that it is aware, an uncanny distinction from other species, is not static. It adapts, expands, and responds to environmental demands. But adaptation takes generations. Neural plasticity exists, but structural change happens slowly. Modern environments demand cognitive capacities that evolution has not prepared us for, nor is it going to anytime soon. Sustained executive function on the spot for over 8 hours daily in one chunk. The CEO was never designed to operate continuously without rest or deviation from that spot. Filtering unprecedented sensory and information input. The Gatekeeper evolved in environments with far less stimulation, variation, novelty, intensity, and potential threat. Managing digital connectivity while maintaining physical presence. The nervous system, like the brain of which it is an extension of, cannot distinguish between real and simulated social interaction, leading to chronic dysregulation. Navigating environments optimized for machines, not mammals. Industrial schedules, artificial lighting, sedentary work, all contradict our biological imperatives. For neurotypical individuals, this creates stress. For neurodivergent individuals, it perpetuates systemic failure. When your CEO is weak, and your shadow is overactive, and your messengers are dysregulated, and your gatekeeper is compromised, and your encoder struggles, and your horse cannot regulate, you are not just unequipped for neurotypical environments. You're royally screwed. And you are waiting for the environments to afford you some form of respite, recovery, and adaptation. It is not happening. Coherence starts with the individual. Industrial toxins and neural development. This effect is not solely psychological or social. There are literal, physical, environmental factors affecting neurodevelopment. Heavy metals like lead and mercury, massively prevalent in our day-to-day society, with global exposure contributing to millions of deaths and significant health problems annually, interfere with dopamine, the pursuit messenger, and serotonin, the stability messenger, systems. Pesticides and herbicides, found on 96% of samples of all 12 types of produce, and over a third of our foods contain a cocktail of more than one of these, disrupt endocrine function, affecting neurotransmitter, all messenger production. Air pollution is linked to increased ADHD and autism diagnoses. Microplastics cross the blood-brain barrier, causing inflammation, cell damage, and altering our cognitive function, leaving staggering implications of which we are only beginning to understand. Electromagnetic radiation from constant device exposure affects sleep, circadian rhythms, and neural function. Blue light exposure from screens disrupts the circadian system, which evolved to regulate sleep-wake cycles based solely on sunlight. For the entirety of mammalian evolution, darkness meant rest and light meant activity. Now blue light from devices tricks the brain into thinking it is perpetually daytime, suppressing melatonin production, fragmenting sleep, and dysregulating the entire hormonal cascade that depends on circadian rhythm. This affects serotonin production, dopamine regulation, and nervous system recovery, all of which neurodivergent individuals already struggle with, and all of which require we sleep like we did in the pre-screen world in order to not be technically broken. These are not fringe concerns. These are measurable environmental factors that disproportionately affect neurodevelopment. And neurodivergent individuals, whose symptoms are already operating with less margin for error, are more vulnerable to these disruptions. The epidemic is not just increased recognition of neurodivergent conditions because of increased awareness and diagnosis numbers. It is also a genuine increase across the generations on Earth today that is driven by the environmental toxicities I've just outlined and more that previous generations did not face. Social fragmentation and faux connection. Human nervous systems naturally co-regulate. Your horse calms in the presence of another regulated horse. This is not a metaphor, it is shared biology. Nervous systems synchronize when together, like our brain's neural networks do when in a conversation. Our heart rates entrain when with one another, and emotional states transfer in the field between people in physical proximity. Again, known science. For most of human history, social connection was physical, local, and consistent. You lived near your family, you worked alongside the community, you had sustained in-person contact with the same people over years or decades that you knew from birth. Modern life has obliterated this. Geographic mobility separates people from extended family and long-term community. Digital, quote, connection provides the illusion of social contact without the nervous system regulation that physical presence provides. Transactional relationships replace sustained reciprocal bonds. Co-workers and colleagues you see for a few years, acquaintances you interact with digitally but never physically. Parasocial relationships, influencers, celebrities, curated online personas, hijack social instincts without providing genuine connection. And the retreat into private, reclusive life. For the vast majority of human history, life was communal. Living, working, eating, and socializing, both verbally and non-verbally, in shared spaces. Privacy as we know it, living as individuals isolated behind literal and metaphorical walls, is a shockingly recent concept, emerging only in the last few centuries and accelerating dramatically in the last few decades. Now, most people spend the majority of their time, outside of their day-to-day obligations, in private, within a box of four walls and behind a door, with access to anything they want at any given moment. Food, entertainment, information, stimulation beyond their wildest fantasies, and simulated social contact. All delivered with no friction, no effort, and no genuine human connection. This frictionless access has substituted for the entire connective tissue of human life, with connectedness and harmony being the core components to human happiness that are now alien. Not convenience, not access, not privacy, but connection. We have traded the discomfort of sustained human proximity for the ease of isolated consumption, despite our ancestors achieving this pre-industrially, and we are profoundly dysregulated and disconnected from our true natures as a result. Our horses evolved to regulate through co-regulation with other horses. But modern environments provide almost no opportunity for this in non-hierarchical and non-superficial ways. We are surrounded by more people than ever, yet profoundly more isolated than ever. We can have thousands of, quote, connections online, but no one whose nervous system and brains your horse and rider can entrain with in the real world. For neurodivergent individuals, whose horses are already dysregulated and whose riders are already discombobulated, this absence of co-regulation is catastrophic. The neurodivergent need more co-regulatory support than neurotypical people as it is, but are receiving less than any previous generation in human history. Unprecedented information overload. The human brain evolved to process information from immediate surroundings. A few dozen people, local geography, seasonal changes, occasional novelty, if lucky. Now we have access to the entirety of human knowledge, updated in real time, delivered through devices engineered to capture, and most insidiously keep, our attention. Every notification is a demand. Every headline is designed to trigger emotional response. Every feed is algorithmically optimized to keep you scrolling. Every platform is competing for your attention using techniques refined by billions in research funding to determine how best to tap into, and again most insidiously override, those mammalian instincts. Your gatekeeper cannot filter this volume of input. Your shadow is constantly redirecting to novelty, despite your CEO's wishes, and your CEO cannot maintain focus because the environment is designed to prevent sustained attention while the round hole simultaneously demands it. Your encoder cannot consolidate because you never stop consuming new information long enough for consolidation to occur. And critically, your brain cannot distinguish between information about things happening to you and information about things happening to others. When you read about a tragedy, your nervous system responds as though you are in danger. When you see outrage, your horse activates its sympathetic activation, fight, flight, or freeze response. When you consume endless bad news, your system remains in threat mode, your shadow's hypervigilance, even though you are literally physically safe. This is a complete evolutionary mismatch. Your nervous system evolved to respond to information about your immediate environment. It was never designed to process global scale information in real time. The neurodivergent individuals whose systems are already operating with compromised filtering and heightened sensitivity. Information overload is not just overwhelming, it is neurologically destabilizing, short-term and long-term. The path we're not even on. The neurodiversity movement advocates for accommodation within existing systems through its threefold framework: awareness, acceptance, and inclusion. But these systems themselves are fundamentally incompatible with mammalian neurology, let alone neurodivergent neurology. No amount of accommodation will make 8 hours of sustained executive function sustainable for a weak CEO. No amount of awareness will reduce the sensory overload in open plan offices and fluorescent lit schools with their curriculums designed for polytropic attention. No amount of acceptance will change the fact that algorithmic manipulation, industrial toxins, social fragmentation, and information overload are actively degrading human cognition and nervous system function. The zero-step camp path we are on, progressiveness, accommodation, inclusion, treats neurodivergence as an individual pathologized problem requiring support for those individuals within systems that remain unchanged. But what if the systems themselves are the problem? What if this epidemic is not neurodivergent people failing to adapt, but systems designed for machines encountering humans who, soon, will not be needed to work alongside those machines? What if coherence does not come from making neurodivergent people fit better into round holes, but from recognizing that the round holes are incompatible with human flourishing generally, and neurodivergent flourishing specifically? The world we built is failing us. Not because we are broken, but because the world we find ourselves in was built so fundamentally wrong. Deep down, we know this. We've just ignored it and soothed. But the solution is not waiting for the world to change, or more awareness, or more entitlement to accommodation, inclusion, and adjustments. The solution is coherence, and all practicalities are downstream from it. The individual threshold. If you suspect you are neurodivergent, if any of this book has resonated, if you recognize your rider, your messengers, your horse in these pages, there are thresholds you must cross before coherence becomes possible. Not steps, not instructions, thresholds. Gates that must be walked through because the systems you inhabit demand it, and because what lies beyond them cannot be accessed any other way. This is not a roadmap. This is recognition of what stands between you and the capacity to modulate your own coherence so that you can begin to reconcile with that reality and do something about it if you choose. The diagnostic gate. The first threshold is diagnosis. Without diagnosis, you are self-identifying, and self-identification carries no weight in the systems you must navigate. Without diagnosis, you cannot access medication or treatment, you have no legal standing for workplace accommodations, educational institutions will not provide you support, you cannot explain your struggles to others with any authority, and you remain labelled as, quote, difficult, lazy, unmotivated, or incompetent rather than neurodivergent. Diagnosis is not coherence. It is not the destination, but it is the entry gate. Everything that follows requires this threshold to be crossed first. Why diagnosis matters structurally. The systems you inhabit operate on documentation. They do not operate on self-knowledge or intuition. If you say, I think I have ADHD, or I believe I'm autistic, the response is, well, do you have a diagnosis? Without that formal assessment and that clinical confirmation, you have nothing that the system recognises. You are simply someone making excuses for yourself, and they will have no shame in brushing you off. Diagnosis does several things. First, it legitimises your experience. Not to you, you already know what it is like to be you, and that any of your struggles are real, but to everyone else. To employers, educators, family, partners. The diagnosis says, this is not a character flaw, this is neurology. Then it opens access to treatment and support. Medication cannot be prescribed without diagnosis. Coaching, workplace accommodations, educational support all require diagnosis. It also provides legal protection. In many jurisdictions, diagnosed neurodivergence falls under disability protections. Without diagnosis, you have no legal standing. With it, you have recourse. Lastly, it allows you to explain yourself coherently. When you say, I have ADHD or I'm autistic, people have a framework, however incomplete, for understanding why you operate differently. Without diagnosis, you are explaining with no authority and no shared reference point. The reality of the diagnostic process. Getting diagnosed is not easy. NHS waiting lists are catastrophic and private assessments are expensive. Both subjects I've already detailed in this book. But this is not a reason to avoid it. Instead, this is a reason to prioritise it. If you are in the UK, get on the NHS waiting list immediately. If financially possible, pursue private assessment. Use access to work funding if employed, it can cover costs in some cases. If you are elsewhere, research diagnostic pathways in your region and pursue the fastest accessible route. And of course, check the Neurodiversity Directory for solutions and support. Diagnosis is not the end. Receiving a diagnosis does not and will not make you coherent. It does not fix anything. It does not grant accommodation automatically. In fact, it gives you a badge. That's it. But it is the prerequisite for everything that follows. Without it, you remain unrecognised, without access, legally unprotected, explaining yourself with no authority. With it, you have standing, you have access, you have language, you have the ability to begin modulating coherence rather than simply surviving incompatibility. Walk through the gate, everything else waits on the other side. What treatment and medication actually does. Once you have walked through the diagnostic gate, The next threshold involves understanding what treatment and medication can and cannot do. This is not a prescription. This is clarity about what the available interventions actually provide, so you can make the informed decisions rather than operating on false expectations and ultimately have an accurate understanding of this landscape, neurodivergent or not. Medication is not coherence, it is scaffolding. Stimulant medications for ADHD, methylphenidate, Ritalin, Concerta, and amphetamines, Adderall, Vyvanse, Elvance, Amphexxa, etc., increase dopamine and norepinephrine availability. They do not fix your brain. They do not make you neurotypical. They provide the neurochemical support your CEO and your pursuit systems need to function. What stimulants do to the neurodivergent mind? Increase baseline dopamine, allowing tasks that were neurochemically unrewarding to feel worth pursuing. Extend dopamine signal duration, so motivation can be sustained beyond the initial spark. Raise norepinephrine, bringing arousal into the range where the CEO can come online and maintain focus. And allow the shadow to be overridden more effectively, reducing the constant hijacking by novelty. What stimulants do not do? Make you productive without structure. Make you effective without intention. Fix executive function without you building systems. Create motivation for things you genuinely do not care about. Eliminate the need for environmental design, boundaries, or regulation. And produce coherence. They provide capacity which you must then direct with your CEO. Stimulants allow the rider to function more like a neurotypical rider, but the rider still needs to know where it is going. Medication without structure, without self-awareness, without intentional modulation, does nothing sustainable. Without the correct understanding and intentions, the outcome at best is merely placing a jetpack on a fool. This is why some people try medication and report it didn't work. The medication worked. It increased dopamine and norepinephrine, but they did not have the structures in place to use that increased capacity effectively. The CEO came online, but there was no direction. The pursuit system activated, but there was no clarity about what to pursue. Being lost with more energy is still lost. Medication is the scaffolding. It holds the structure while you build, but it is not the structure itself. Therapy, counselling, and coaching. Cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT, ADHD and ASD coaching, autism coaching, and neurodiversity informed, not neurodiversity affirming, this term is a misnomer and irrelevant, therapy can be valuable, but only if the therapist, counsellor, or coach understands that they are not fixing you. Good therapy or counselling or coaching for neurodivergent individuals helps you recognise patterns in your rider, messengers, and horse that you may be oblivious to, provides external structure while you build internal capacity and capabilities, challenges distorted beliefs such as I am lazy versus my dopamine system operates differently, teaches regulation tools that work with your actual nervous system, and acts as a mirror to your own reality and experiences to help you see, accept, and work with your own specifications clearly. Bad therapy or counselling or coaching for neurodivergent individuals treats neurodivergence as a problem. Neurodiversity affirming does the opposite, but that should now be common sense, to overcome through willpower. Applies neurotypical frameworks without adaptation. Focuses on productivity hacks without addressing underlying dysregulation, and encourages masking rather than coherence. Therapy is useful when it helps you understand your system and build structures around it. It is not useful when it tries to make you neurotypical. Treatment is a tool, not a solution. Medication, therapy, counselling, coaching, and any accommodations, all of these are tools, and useful ones at that. They provide support, they reduce friction, they create capacity. But they do not create coherence. You create coherence. Coherence requires understanding your rider, your messengers, your gatekeeper, your encoder, your horse. It requires self-awareness, knowing how your system operates, self-compassion, not pathologizing your differences, regardless of difficulties, and sovereignty, internalizing power and agency over your character and its story, and building structures that work for you rather than waiting for permission. Treatment supports this process, but it is not the process itself. If you walk through the diagnostic gate, access medication, begin therapy or counselling or coaching, and expect those interventions alone to make you functional, you will be disappointed. Not because the interventions failed, but because you did not use them as scaffolding to build your own coherence. The diagnostic gate opens access. Treatment provides support, but coherence is achieved through a lifetime of modulation, the ongoing intentional adjustment of your internal and external environments, your structures and your responses to life and navigation through it based on what your system and its specifications actually need. No entitlement, just clarity, compassion, and the desire to earnestly do your best for yourself, then all others. Modulation, intentional coherence as practice. Coherence is not a destination. It is not something you achieve once and then possess forever. It is modulation, the ongoing, deliberate tuning of your internal and external life based on what you honestly need in any given moment. Modulation is the practice of singularity. It is the collapse of oscillation into wholeness, maintained not through static perfection, but through continuous, conscious tuning and recalibration. This is not a set of steps. This is a principle. And the principle is this: you are responsible for maintaining your own coherence. And coherence requires that you modulate constantly. What modulation means in practice. Modulation is self-awareness in action. It is knowing how your rider, your messengers, your gatekeeper, your encoder, and your horse operate, and then adjusting in real time when you notice dysregulation. It's about being the one who recognizes in yourself when your CEO is offline and cannot be forced online through willpower, when your shadow is hijacking attention because your dopamine baseline is too low or your environment is over or under stimulating, when your gatekeeper is overwhelmed and sensory input is flooding through unfiltered, when your encoder is struggling because you've not slept or your working memory is overloaded, when your horse is in sympathetic, fight, flight, fawn, activation, or dorsal shutdown, freeze, and no amount of cognitive effort will restore function. And you respond accordingly, not with self-judgment, but with structural adjustment. That is modulation. It's important to make the distinction between reactivity and responsiveness with modulation. It is not, I am dysregulated, therefore I have failed, reactive. It is, I am dysregulated, therefore I adjust, responsive. There must be no reacting with collapse and only responding with agency. This might mean stopping work when your CEO is offline rather than forcing unproductive hours, removing sensory input when your gatekeeper is overwhelmed rather than pushing through, prioritizing sleep when your encoder is struggling rather than consuming more information, allowing rest when your horse is in shutdown rather than demanding performance, and reducing stimulation when your shadow is hyperactive rather than fighting distraction with more stimulation. These are not accommodations you request from others. These are sovereignty decisions you can only make for yourself by understanding yourself. Modulation requires the three S's. This is why, without the Rosetta Stone of the three S's, you cannot have the key to functioning coherence at the individual level. And why, regardless of any awareness, accommodation, and inclusion, without the individual having sovereignty over their own responsibility, progress is not possible. The Rosetta Stone, self-awareness, self-compassion, sovereignty, isn't abstract. It's the foundation of modulation. Self-awareness is knowing your system well enough and being close enough to your being moment to moment without collapse, self-abandonment, and externalizing power to recognize when it is dysregulated and what it needs. Without this, you can only react in limiting, judgmental self-talk without understanding and growth. Self-compassion is responding to dysregulation without pathologizing yourself. When your CEO cannot focus, self-compassion says, "My dopaminergic system is off right now," rather than "I am lazy and I hate when I'm like this and that this happens to me." When your horse shuts down, self-compassion sees, "My nervous system must be protecting me," rather than "I feel so weak and I am how I feel." Sovereignty is acting on what you know without waiting for permission or external validation. When you recognize dysregulation, you adjust, even if it inconveniences others, even if it disrupts expectations, even if it requires saying no to demands you cannot meet, even if you're wrong in the end. If you are wrong while hurting nobody, and make sure you learn from it, then you will be right in the long run. With these principles, you will only either win or learn. There is nothing to lose with individual sovereignty. Modulation with sovereignty is coherence in motion. Modulation without sovereignty is insight without action. You know what you need, but you do not take it because you are waiting for external powers to validate and accommodate. Modulation is not perfection. You will dysregulate. Your CEO will go offline. Your shadow will hijack. Your gatekeeper will fail. Your horse will collapse, especially in this day and age, as I've covered. This is not failure. This is normal operation and fluctuation for your system. Modulation is not preventing dysregulation. Modulation is accepting that it is inevitable, recognizing it when it happens, and adjusting on your own 2 feet rather than forcing functionality that is not available because of yours or others' broken expectations. Neurotypical people modulate unconsciously. Their systems self-correct without conscious intervention. The neurodivergent system does not. Therefore, modulation must be conscious, intentional, and ongoing. There is no way around this, and I cannot, yet, be clearer about this. None of this is weakness or disorder. This is the reality of operating with different specifications and pretending you can achieve neurotypical coherence, where regulation happens automatically, is not ambitious or worthwhile. It is delusion and denial. Eventually, you'd break and have to revisit this. Coherence is lived. Modulation is not something you do once. It is something you do constantly, every day, multiple times per day, every time it is needed, for the rest of your life. There is no alternative. This is not burdensome. This is what it means to live coherently with your actual neurology. You are not waiting for the world to change. You are not waiting for accommodation. You are not waiting for permission. You are modulating, adjusting, recalibrating, building, protecting, maintaining, based on what you know about how your system operates. This is your first job, your first responsibility as a human being. It just wasn't taught to you up until now. The diagnostic gate gave you access. Treatment gave you support. Modulation is what you do with both. This is the individual threshold. This is where coherence begins and continues. Not as a state you achieve, but as a practice you maintain, as principle, backed by the principles in this book. You are the only one who can do this. No system will do it for you. No therapist, counsellor, or coach, no medication, and no accommodation will create coherence on your behalf. You modulate, or you remain oscillating between dysregulated and dysphoric. That is the choice, and now you have the knowledge to make it. Systems optimized for reality. The individual threshold addresses the imperatives for achieving coherence within systems that are fundamentally incompatible, the round holes, with certain specifications, the square pegs. But there is a larger question, still, that the neurodiversity movement has failed to ask. What if the systems themselves were designed differently? Not accommodation within existing structures. Not awareness and inclusion grafted onto industrial frameworks. But systems built from the ground up to work with human neurology, neurodivergent and neurotypical, rather than against it. This is not a prescription. This is not a blueprint. This is the vision that becomes possible once we accept that the one thing the neurodiversity movement got right is the idea that we are all different, and we stop treating neurodivergence as a problem and start recognizing that our environments are. What reality actually requires. Human beings, all of us, not just neurodivergent ones, are mammals with nervous systems that require co-regulation, physical connection, and sustained social bonds. Paleolithic brains operating in environments that demand cognitive capacities evolution never prepared us for. And systems that dysregulate under chronic stress, sensory overload, information saturation, and social fragmentation. Industrial standardization, compulsory uniformity, 8-hour workdays, open plan offices, fluorescent lighting, algorithmic manipulation, constant connectivity. These are incompatible with mammalian neurology generally. Neurodivergent individuals are not special or superheroes, nor are they an epidemic to be contained or a population to be included and adjusted for. They are the canaries in the coal mine. I cannot state this clearly enough. The neurodivergent are the canaries in the coal mine. They are the first to collapse under conditions that are degrading for everyone. But the conditions themselves are the problem, not the group of people who cannot tolerate them as well as the other group. Systems optimized for reality would not ask, how do we make neurodivergent people fit and function? They would ask, how do we make our environment such that all human nervous systems can flourish? Work. I'll be as succinct as I possibly can. This is to aid the coherence in the other leaders, founders, managers, and those who have power and pull in organizations, groups, teams, and institutions out there. Flexible schedules based on individual arousal patterns. Not everyone's CEO comes online at 9 a.m. Some people function best early in the morning, some late in the evening, some in short bursts throughout the day. Systems optimized for reality would allow people to work when their neurology supports focus, not when the clock demands it. And certainly not when those at the top of the hierarchy are most comfortable with. Hint, we have always done it this way is a hallmark of idiocy. Whenever you hear this, you are closest to the change that is needed, and usually also the person or people that, much like trolls, are blocking the way. Asynchronous collaboration over real-time demands. Constant meetings that could have been an email exchange. Recurring sit-downs about the recurring sit-downs. Instant response expectations. And real-time collaboration exhaust executive function and prevent deep work. Systems optimized for reality would prioritize individual performance and output and asynchronous communication, allowing people to engage when their capacity is available rather than fragmenting attention across constant interruptions. Of course, real-time collaboration is a key part of any endeavour. Although if deep work is the priority of any organisation and pursuit, which it should be, then routine collaboration outside of that deep work will only aid connectivity and creativity. Sensory-friendly environments as default. Open plan offices are sensory and sovereignty hellscapes. Fluorescent lighting, background noise, and visual clutter all overwhelm gatekeepers. Systems optimized for reality would provide privacy and quiet spaces for deep work, natural lighting for appropriate levels of stimulation, and environments where sensory input is minimized by design, not grudgingly accommodated upon request. Output-based evaluation, not time-based. Sitting in a chair for 8 hours does not equal productivity. Bums on seats for the comfort of hierarchical power is a direct descendant of factory lines. Systems optimized for reality would measure what is produced by the individual, not how many hours they visibly spent sat in a specific spot. If someone completes their work in 4 focused hours, they are done, not required to perform presence for another 4. The fact this is still even a conversation is a farce. Rest as structural requirement, not luxury. Humans require downtime for nervous system regulation, memory consolidation, and cognitive recovery. Systems optimized for reality would build rest into the structure, mandated breaks, protected off hours, seasonal rhythms that allow recovery rather than perpetual output demands. If you remember, it is through the rider's network / hat switching that breakthroughs occur, and the modern working day does not accommodate for this, which is ironic and painfully stupid. Education. Until these are integrated, our compulsory education system continues to fail our children, generation after generation. Individualized pacing, not age-based cohorts. Children and genders develop at different rates. Forcing uniformity creates failure for those who develop differently. Systems optimized for reality would allow students to progress based on mastery, not age, and would recognize that intellectual capability is not the same as developmental readiness. Interest-driven learning over compulsory curriculum. The CEO cannot sustain attention on material that generates no dopamine. Systems optimized for reality would allow students to pursue areas of genuine interest, using that intrinsic motivation as the foundation for broader skill development, rather than forcing engagement with irrelevant content. Movement, sensory input, and nervous system regulation as foundational. Sitting still for hours is incompatible with mammalian neurology, especially for children. Systems optimized for reality would integrate this clear fact. Movement, sensory breaks, and regulation practices as core components of the school day, not punishments or accommodations, or breaks between subject switching. Competency demonstration over standardized testing. Standardized tests measure performance under artificial time pressure and sensory constraint. Systems optimized for reality would allow students to demonstrate mastery through projects, application, and varied formats that do not penalize encoding or processing differences. Teaching the right things. Now, this isn't a direct dig at Pythagoras, and is only a partially biased statement, but why is none of what I have included in this book taught in schools? I'll leave that one with you. Social. Geographic stability and long-term community. Humans regulate through sustained physical social bonds. Systems optimized for reality would prioritize local, long-term community over transactional relationships and geographic mobility that fractures social networks. Physical co-regulation spaces over digital connection. Digital interaction does not provide the nervous system regulation that presence does. Systems optimized for reality would create environments where people gather in person regularly, not as optional socializing, but as structural necessity for connection, harmony, and regulation. Reduced information access, not infinite connectivity. The human brain is not designed to process global scale information in real time. Systems optimized for reality would recognize that constant information connectivity is neurologically destabilizing and would structurally limit access rather than demanding individuals exercise restraint against algorithms designed to capture attention. Health. Preventive regulation over reactive treatment. Current healthcare treats dysregulation after it becomes a crisis. Systems optimized for reality would prioritize nervous system regulation, sleep, sensory management, and environmental design as primary interventions, with medication as support rather than first-line response. Diagnostic access without years-long waiting lists. If diagnosis is the entry gate to treatment and waiting lists span years, the system is structurally failing. Systems optimized for reality would provide immediate diagnostic access, recognizing that early intervention prevents so much. Neurodiversity informed care as default. Clinicians would understand that neurodivergent individuals are not broken neurotypicals. Treatment would be designed around actual neurological differences, rather than attempting to force neurotypical function through willpower and accommodation. Justice. Recognition of executive dysfunction in legal proceedings. Neurodivergent individuals are disproportionately represented in criminal justice systems. Not because they are more criminal, but because executive dysfunction, impulse control issues, and social communication differences make them more likely to be arrested, convicted, and incarcerated for behaviours that neurotypical individuals navigate without legal consequence. Systems optimized for reality would therefore recognise that difficulty understanding social cues can lead to misinterpretation of police instructions. Impulse control issues are neurochemical, not moral failures. Executive dysfunction affects the ability to comply with probation requirements, court dates, and complex legal processes. And sensory overload in interrogation or courtroom environments impairs the ability to advocate for oneself. Diversion programs over incarceration for neurodivergent offenders. Prison is neurologically catastrophic for neurodivergent individuals. Sensory overload, lack of autonomy, rigid schedules that ignore individual regulation needs, and violence all guarantee nervous system collapse and further fallout from society. Systems optimized for reality would prioritize diversion into treatment, regulation support, and community-based accountability rather than incarceration for offences driven by dysregulation rather than intent to harm. Legal representation trained in neurodivergence. Lawyers, judges, and juries do not understand that a neurodivergent person's testimony may appear inconsistent due to encoding issues, that their body language may not match neurotypical expectations, or that their difficulty articulating themselves under pressure is neurological, not deceptive. Systems optimized for reality would require legal professionals to understand neurodivergent presentation so that justice is based on facts, not misinterpretation of neurological differences. Police training in neurodivergent interaction. Autistic individuals are significantly more likely to be injured or killed in police interactions because their responses do not match expected compliance patterns. Lack of eye contact, difficulty processing rapid verbal instructions, stimming behaviours, or meltdowns are misinterpreted as aggression or non-compliance. Systems optimised for reality would therefore train law enforcement to recognise neurodivergent presentation and de-escalate without force, understanding that what appears as defiance is often sensory overload or processing delay. Why institutional change will not happen without collapse. These are not radical ideas. They are obvious once you recognise that the current systems are incompatible with all human neurology. But they will not be implemented voluntarily because they require dismantling industrial standardisation, compulsory uniformity, and the profit structures built on perpetual productivity and attention extraction. And no, capitalism is not the problem. We are for not having understood all of this and held it coherently enough up until now. The systems we have are not accidents. They are designed to maximise output and maintain control. Changing them would require admitting they were built wrong from the beginning, and institutions do not voluntarily contract their own power. This is why the neurodiversity movement's focus on accommodation within existing systems is insufficient. It asks round holes to tolerate square pegs, and the square pegs to be tolerable. It does not ask why the holes are round in the first place, and if we should do anything about that for all of our species. It requires the division and the round holes in order to exist. Change will come not through progressive advocacy, but through systemic failure. When enough systems collapse, with enough people collapsing under their incompatible demands, when productivity degrades beyond acceptable thresholds, when the costs of dysregulation exceed the costs of redesign, then systems will change, not because they chose to, but because they must. Until then, the individual threshold for the neurodivergent remains. Understand your system, walk through the diagnostic gate, access treatment, and modulate your own coherence. Because the world will not change for you in time. And for the others, you must still understand and integrate this knowledge, or else. As knowing what systems optimised for reality could look like is not fantasy. It is the vision we must carry as we build new systems, new structures, new environments, and a new level of coherence. We are not building for the world as it is. We are building for the world as it will be. And every structure we create that works with our species' natural neurology, rather than against it, is proof that it is possible for us to do right by us and nature itself. This is the way of what is to come.